When I was in elementary school, my folks moved us to Long An, down in the Mekong Delta. It was flat, hot, humid, pretty much all year round. You'd think moving out to the countryside meant we'd end up at some tiny rundown school, but actually, the local government had just built this huge public school there. It was kind of a big deal for the area. I was in 3rd grade when the really messed up stuff started happening, but before I get into that, I got to explain how the school was set up. One thing that stood out about our school was the back fence. Instead of concrete walls, it was just rows of tall iron bars with these sharp spear-shaped tips on top. Mostly to keep thieves out, I guess. But the weird part was, you could see straight through them. The school cafeteria sat right up against that fence. Running it was this woman. I don't even want to use her real name, so I'll just call her the cafeteria lady. She was a real piece of work, always walking around with these heavy gold bracelets clinking together every time she moved, just making sure everybody knew she had money. And since she was basically the only person selling snacks at school, every kid ended up buying from her. See, recess was only about 15 minutes long. Imagine the bell ringing, and 300 kids storming this one little counter all at once, screaming for sodas, shaved ice, and snacks. It was pure chaos, like a zombie horde. If you weren't in the front row, you were screwed. You'd spend your whole 15 minutes getting crushed, and then the drum would sound. We didn't have an electronic bell, just this guy beating a massive leather drum, and you'd have to go back to class empty-handed. Now, right on the other side of that iron fence, there was a canal. I never measured it, but I'd guess it was maybe 10 feet across, and it stretched for miles, connecting one river to another. The water was always that opaque, murky brown. Spanning across this canal was a rickety bamboo bridge, and on the other side sat a tiny, dilapidated shack with a roof made of dried palm leaves. An old woman lived there with her grandson. The kid was maybe 2 or 3 years older than me, but he never went to school. Let's call him Toby. Toby was always shirtless, wearing these dirty shorts, hair completely matted, just sitting by the muddy bank, poking the water with a stick. I guess the old lady realized that half the kids weren't getting their snacks, so she started a little side hustle. Every day at recess, she'd balance these 2 massive woven baskets on a yoke across her shoulders, wobble across that bamboo bridge, and set up shop right outside our iron fence. She had sodas, sliced fruit, chips, everything the tuck shop had. And the kids figured it out fast. Why fight the mob inside when you could just shove your money through the bars and get a soda instantly? I'm talking like a dozen kids at first, then 20, then 50. It was a booming business, but technically she was breaking the rules. The school is responsible for what kids eat on the premises, right? If some kid gets food poisoning from fence snacks, the school gets sued. So the administration talked to her, gave her a warning, but she kept at it. She was poor, she needed the cash, but the tuck shop lady, she was livid. She felt like her territory was being invaded. She complained to the principal, crying about how she paid rent and taxes for the space, while this old hag was stealing her profits from the dirt outside. So, the school finally cracked down hard and banned the old lady from the perimeter. But the old lady was smart. She found a loophole. If the school guards chased her away, she'd just send her grandson, Toby. The school guards couldn't really bring themselves to aggressively manhandle a 10-year-old kid in dirty shorts, so Toby became the new vendor. The tuck shop lady turned downright venomous after that. If she caught you buying from Toby, she'd blacklist you. I know this because I experienced it firsthand. One day, the tuck shop line was just too long, and I was dying of thirst, so I bought a little plastic cup of soda from Toby through the fence. The next day, I went to the tuck shop early. I reached my hand over the high counter with my money, asking for a drink. The tuck shop lady slammed her heavy hand down on my arm, her gold bracelets digging right into my skin. I can still feel the sting of it. She spat at me, demanding to know why I didn't go buy from the fence kid instead. I was just a dumb 2nd grader. I was terrified. She literally charged me double, like, she bumped the price from a few cents to a nickel, which was a huge deal for a kid back then, just out of pure spite. She remembered every single kid who bought from the fence, and she punished all of us. She wasn't just awful to us, though. She had a son of her own, about Toby's age. Let's call him Tyler. Tyler didn't go to school either, even though his mom practically owned the cafeteria. She just used him as free child labor. He'd be lugging heavy bags of ice, hauling firewood, serving kids, and if he messed up, she would beat the absolute crap out of him right in front of everyone, slapping his head, pulling his ears. It was brutal. Anyway, that was the normal, crappy reality of our school, until late April. We were in the middle of studying for our final exams before summer break. The whole school was dead quiet, just the low hum of kids reciting math tables. Out of nowhere, we heard it. Thump, thump, thump. It was a drum, but it wasn't our school drum. It was slower, heavier, the unmistakable rhythm of a traditional funeral drum echoing from behind the school. My whole class stopped. We all looked around, totally confused. Our teacher told us to ignore it, but the sound just hung in the heavy, humid air for hours. When recess hit, my buddies and I ran out to the yard. I looked over toward the fence, expecting to see Toby selling his snacks, but the spot was empty. The shack across the canal had a bunch of people gathered around it. Some kids were whispering that the old lady must be throwing a party, but kids are stupid. You don't play funeral drums at a party. We didn't know who died, and honestly, we didn't really care. We just went back to playing tag. For the next few weeks, the fence was completely abandoned. The old lady's house was shut tight. The tuck shop lady was gloating, taking her sweet time serving us, jacking up prices because she knew she was the only game in town again. Then summer hit. 3 whole months of doing nothing. Occasionally, a group of us guys would sneak back to the school grounds in the evenings to steal fruit from the mango and starfruit trees growing near the back fence. One night, we were back there, and my buddy mentioned he had seen the old lady cleaning her house earlier that week. He said he actually asked her if she was going to sell snacks next year, and she had smiled this really sad, tired smile, and promised she'd be back when school started. But then another kid chimed in, saying he saw something weird a few days prior. He said he was near the canal at dusk, and he saw Toby. But here's where my stomach started to knot up. My friend said Toby was standing in the canal, just standing in the water. Now, I told you that canal was deep, but my friend swore that Toby was standing dead center in the middle of the murky water, and it only came up to his waist. That was physically impossible, unless the kid was 10 feet tall. My friend said he called out to Toby, trying to kiss up to him so we could get cheap snacks next year. He offered him a mango, but Toby didn't say a word. He just stared up from the water with this devastatingly hollow look on his face, and when my friend turned around for half a second to pluck a mango from the branch, Toby was gone. Not a splash, no ripples, just vanished. I tried to brush it off as my friend making up ghost stories to sound cool, but then I saw him myself. It was maybe 8 o'clock at night, pitch black except for the streetlights bleeding through the school gates. A few of us were walking home along the dirt path that paralleled the canal. One of the girls in our group suddenly stopped and pointed toward the bamboo bridge. There was Toby. He was just standing there by the bridge, his hands clasped behind his back, looking over at us. It looked like the lonely, pathetic stance of a kid who just wanted to be included. Some of the guys suggested we go talk to him, maybe sweet-talk him for next year's snacks. We started jogging toward him, and I swear to God, I am not making this up. As we got closer, Toby started moving backward, but he wasn't taking steps. His legs were perfectly straight, completely still. He was just gliding, receding backward into the oppressive darkness of the trees. We stopped dead in our tracks. My friend mumbled something about how Toby's feet didn't seem to be touching the dirt, and how he didn't cast a shadow. My heart was hammering in my throat. My brain scrambled to rationalize it. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, that the shadows were messing with our depth perception, that it was totally normal. I desperately needed it to be normal. We nervously laughed it off and sprinted the rest of the way home, pretending everything was fine. It wasn't fine. When the new school year started in September, the old lady didn't set up her baskets. Sometimes we'd see her sweeping her porch across the canal, looking like she had aged 20 years. but she never came to the fence. The cafeteria, on the other hand, was open, but Tyler was broken. He wasn't hauling ice or serving sodas. He was just sitting on this folding canvas chair in the corner of the cafeteria, staring into space with this slack-jawed, vacant grin. When kids tried to hand him money, he just stared at them. Then he started wandering. During class, he would aimlessly shuffle around the empty schoolyard. A few times, I was sitting in class, and Tyler's head would just slowly pop up in the window frame, staring blankly at us. The teacher would yell at him, but he wouldn't flinch. Eventually, the tuck shop lady would come running out, grab him by the ear, and literally drag him away, slapping his face and screaming at him in front of everyone. But Tyler didn't cry. He didn't even react. He just absorbed the blows like a hollow mannequin. The pressure cooker finally blew about 2 months into the semester. It was mid-morning. We were in the middle of a math lesson when this blood-curdling shriek ripped through the school. "You ungrateful little shit. Are you trying to kill me?" Every single student, teacher, and administrator ran to the windows or out to the hallways. Down in the courtyard, the tuck shop lady was sprinting for her life, and right behind her, chasing her down, was Tyler. But he was holding a massive, heavy, rust-stained meat cleaver, the kind they used to chop pork bones in the kitchen. He was swinging it wildly, but the most fucking terrifying part was his voice. It didn't sound like him. It was this deep, guttural, waterlogged roar. "Why didn't you save me? You let me die. Give me back my life. Give me back my life." He was hunting his own mother. She was crying, screaming curses at him, stumbling over her own feet, while he relentlessly pursued her. He was a big kid, and with that cleaver, he could have easily hacked her to pieces. The male teachers and the security guards finally managed to tackle him to the dirt, pinning his arms until he dropped the knife. The second the cleaver hit the concrete, Tyler's body just went completely limp. The rage evaporated, and he started sobbing, apologizing profusely, having no idea why he was on the ground. And his mother? The second he snapped out of it, she lunged at him, kicking him and beating him mercilessly while the teachers tried to pull her off. We were all horrified. The administration begged her to get him psychological help, to put him in school, but she refused. But things kept escalating. Tyler started slipping away more frequently. A few times during recess, we couldn't find him in the cafeteria. We'd look out toward the back perimeter, and there he was, standing exactly where Toby used to stand by the iron spikes. Tyler would be waving his hands frantically at us, yelling, come by, I have snacks." We'd cautiously walk up to him, asking what he was selling since his hands were empty. He'd smile this crooked, unnatural smile, and start grabbing handfuls of wet mud and rotting leaves from the ground, aggressively shoving them through the iron bars at us, insisting it was candy. When we backed away, totally creeped out, he'd just drop the mud, turn around, and walk straight across the bamboo bridge, right into Toby's grandmother's house, like he belonged there. The absolute climax of this nightmare happened a few weeks later. By third grade, my classroom was on the second floor, and our windows had a direct line of sight to the canal and the old lady's shack. I was sitting in the back row during a morals and ethics class. I noticed the kid sitting a few desks ahead of me, let's call him Sean, was completely frozen, his neck craned awkwardly to the left, staring out the window. He wasn't blinking. He wasn't moving. The teacher noticed and called his name. "Sean, look at the board." Sean didn't move. The teacher walked down the aisle, visibly irritated, and tapped hard on Sean's desk. Sean slowly turned his head. His face was chalk white. He looked up at the teacher and whispered, "Teacher, Toby is calling me. He's waving at me." By this point, the rumor mill had finally cracked the code. Everyone knew Toby had died over the summer, and everyone suspected Tyler was possessed by him. The teacher froze. He told Sean to stop talking nonsense, but Sean just pointed a trembling finger at the window. The teacher didn't even look. He just immediately ordered the kids near the windows to slam the wooden shutters closed and pull the heavy curtains. When the room was plunged into dim light, Sean burst into tears. He said Toby had been standing right outside the iron fence, right below our window. He said Toby was completely drenched, water pooling at his feet. The silence in the classroom was absolutely suffocating until I realized I could hear it. My brain must have tuned it out before, but now it was unmistakable. Drip, splat, drip, splat. It was the heavy, rhythmic sound of soaking wet clothes dripping onto the concrete courtyard below, even though it hadn't rained in weeks. Sean said Toby was staring right up at him with dead, milky eyes, sticking his pale, bloated arm through the iron bars, desperately gesturing for Sean to come down and buy something. The school was in an absolute uproar after that. Curtains had to remain closed, and then, right before the Lunar New Year break, the cafeteria shut down completely. That's when the truth finally spilled out, from the neighborhood gossips who attended the funeral. Not Toby's funeral, Tyler's. We finally learned exactly what happened that summer. The tuck shop lady had been out back, setting up her inventory, keeping a hateful eye on the old lady's shack. She saw Toby grab a massive, heavy woven basket full of snacks. The old lady wasn't around, so Toby decided to carry it himself. He stepped onto the rickety bamboo bridge, struggling under the weight. People said the tuck shop lady literally muttered a curse under her breath, hoping he'd fall, and he did. Toby lost his footing and tumbled into the deep canal, the heavy basket pulling him under. The tuck shop lady stood there. She watched him thrash. She watched his little hands claw at the muddy water, realizing he didn't know how to swim. She didn't scream for help. She didn't call the grandmother. She just stood there, gripping the iron bars, and watched a 10-year-old boy drown to death because it meant she wouldn't lose a few dollars in snack sales. When the bubble stopped, she calmly went back inside. That was why Toby came back. He didn't want revenge on a random kid. He wanted the son of the monster who watched him die. He made her watch her own son lose his mind, made her son turn a blade on her, made her suffer a living hell. And the week before New Year's, Tyler started refusing to sleep. He told his mom that every time he closed his eyes, Toby was there in the dark, telling Tyler that a life was owed. A life for a life. She was going to take him to an exorcist after the holiday. She didn't make it. One morning she went to wake Tyler up, and he was already gone. He didn't die of an illness. He died of pure, unadulterated terror. His body was stiff as a board, his eyes rolled so far back into his skull that only the bloodshot whites were visible. And his jaw was unhinged, locked open in a silent, agonizing scream. They had to massage his joints with rice wine just to get his eyes closed and his mouth shut for the coffin. After Tyler died, the school revoked the tuck shop lady's lease. The old lady never sold a single thing again, just lived out her days in that lonely little shack, and Toby never appeared at the fence again. His debt was collected. I'm an English professor. I've been teaching for a very, very long time, and I need to preface this by saying that I am a deeply logical person. I'm also Catholic, and on top of my regular university lectures, I used to take on extra work teaching English to poor students at local Catholic parishes. I was always busy, always grounded in reality, which means my brain just naturally filters out a lot of the local superstitions. Where I lived, people talked about ghosts and curses all the time, but I always just nodded politely and went to Sunday Mass. I didn't care about spirits. I cared about lesson plans, grading papers, and keeping my students awake. But back in 2003, I took a new position at a university in Saigon, specifically in Bintan district. It was a massive campus, walled off, kind of operating like an old government compound. The very first weird thing happened before I even officially started my regular classes. It was November 20th, which is Teachers' Day over there. It's a huge deal. The university threw this massive outdoor buffet in the main courtyard for all the staff and students. I remember the exact atmosphere. It was around 7 p.m., and the courtyard was absolutely swarming with people. It was loud, chaotic. The air was thick with the smell of fried food, cheap perfume, and that damp, suffocating humidity that makes your clothes stick to your back. It was stuffy, too many bodies breathing the same air. But then, as I was standing near the edge of the crowd, waiting to grab a plate, the temperature just plummeted. And I don't mean a cool evening breeze. I mean a damp, unnatural freeze that started right in my armpits and crept up the back of my neck. It was the kind of cold that makes your bones ache. I literally shivered, rubbing my arms, feeling the goosebumps prickling against the fabric of my aodai, the traditional silk dress we wear to teach. I remember thinking it was so bizarre, so completely out of place in that sweltering crowd, but I just blamed it on exhaustion. I figured I was coming down with a fever or something. So, I walked over to the buffet line. My colleague, let's call her Hazel, was standing next to me. I grabbed a plate and a fork, not chopsticks, just a standard metal fork. I reached over to stab a piece of fried spring roll. I pushed the tines into the roll, lifted it halfway to my plate, and it just slid right off. Plop. Back into the tray. I felt my face get hot. You know that stupid, clumsy feeling when you drop food in front of a bunch of people? I nervously glanced around to see if any of my new students saw me being an idiot. I just muttered to myself that the fork must be covered in grease. So I tried again. This time, I went for a piece of sausage. I drove that fork deep into the sausage. I made absolutely sure it was secured. I even felt the metal scrape the bottom of the aluminum tray. I lifted it up, and I swear to God, the moment the fork hovered over my plate, I felt a physical tug. It wasn't gravity, it wasn't the sausage slipping. It felt exactly like someone had pinched the meat between their thumb and forefinger and violently yanked it downward. The sausage didn't just fall, it launched. It shot off my fork and bounced across the table, rolling away like a golf ball. My hand actually shook from the force of it. I just stood there, staring at my empty fork, my brain completely short-circuiting. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself it was the oil, the angle, my tired wrists, but my stomach was tied in knots because I knew what I felt. Hazel noticed I was struggling. She sort of laughed, took the tongs, and effortlessly grabbed a bunch of food, dropping it onto her plate in 2 seconds. She even offered to get me a new fork, wiping it down with a napkin to make sure it wasn't slippery. I took it, but my hands were sweating so badly. I tried one more time. I aimed for a piece of grilled meat. I stabbed it. Hard. I lifted it, gripping the handle so tight my knuckles were white. And halfway to my plate, a heavy, invisible weight slammed down on my wrist. My whole arm jerked downward. The meat splattered back into the tray with a wet slap. The vibration shot straight up to my elbow. My heart stopped for a full second. I couldn't breathe. I just stared at the buffet table, the noise of the party completely fading out, replaced by this ringing in my ears. I tried to switch to a pair of standard bamboo chopsticks, thinking maybe the fork was just defective, but it was even worse. I couldn't grip a single piece of food. The meat kept slipping out of the wooden sticks like it was coated in thick grease, and the one time I actually managed to pinch a piece of sausage and bring it close to my mouth, that same invisible force swatted the tip of the chopsticks, dropping the food right back into the tray. I felt sick to my stomach. I gave up. I just walked away with an empty plate, trying to look normal while every instinct in my body was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. But the denial is strong, right? We do anything to protect our sanity. I sat down at a table, grabbed a paper cup of soda, and tried to laugh it off. I told myself I was just overworked. I raised the cup to take a sip. Just as the rim touched my lips, someone swatted it. I didn't see a hand, but I felt the distinct upward smack against the bottom of the cup. The soda erupted out of the plastic, splashing all over my face, my chest, ruining my silk dress. The cup flew out of my grip and clattered onto the table. People at the next table turned to look. Hazel gasped and asked what happened. I was sitting there, dripping sticky soda, my face burning with a humiliation so deep it actually hurt. I mumbled some garbage excuse about my hands cramping up from writing on the chalkboard all week. I told her I just had a spasm. But deep down, I was terrified because I didn't drop that cup. It was knocked out of my hand, deliberately, aggressively. I couldn't eat. I couldn't drink. I just sat there in my ruined dress, feeling that freezing, damp air hovering right over my shoulder for the rest of the night. I went home, took a shower, ate a cheap pack of instant noodles, because somehow I could eat perfectly fine the second I was off that campus, and convinced myself it was all just a bizarre string of bad luck. The next morning was my first official lecture. I woke up early, feeling confident again. I had been teaching for a decade. The classroom was my safe space. I had my heavy leather binder, the one I kept my handwritten lesson plans in. I had spent hours preparing it. I got to the university, walked into the classroom, smiled at the freshmen, and opened my binder to the first page. It was blank. I blinked. I flipped to the next page. Blank. I frantically flipped through the entire thick stack of paper. Every single page was completely, starkly white. Not a drop of ink. Nothing. I took my glasses off. My hands were trembling, and wiped the lenses on my shirt. I put them back on. Still blank. My mind was spinning out of control. Did I grab the wrong binder? No. The leather cover had my name embossed on it. Did my kids at home accidentally swap my papers? Impossible. They were too young to even open the heavy clasps. Then I pulled out the printed textbook, a commercially published book I had bought from the store. I opened the textbook, and there was no text, just empty white pages, from cover to cover. No chapters, no page numbers, no copyright text. Nothing. I thought I was having a stroke. I genuinely thought my brain was hemorrhaging, and I was losing the cognitive ability to perceive letters. I stood there, staring at these impossible white pages, the silence in the room getting heavier and heavier as 50 students waited for me to speak. But I'm a professional. I forced myself to snap out of it. I slammed the book shut, plastered a fake smile on my face, and told the class that since it was the first day, we wouldn't use the books. We did introductions, conversation practice, icebreakers. I carried that entire 2-hour lecture entirely from memory, running on pure, unadulterated adrenaline. When the class ended, I practically sprinted to my motorbike and drove straight home. I ran into my living room, unzipped my bag, pulled out the binder, and ripped it open. My handwriting was there. Every single page was completely filled with my blue ink. I pulled out the textbook. The printed letters were right where they were supposed to be. Holy shit. That was the moment my worldview actually cracked. I dropped the binder on the floor and just backed away from it. I couldn't rationalize it anymore. I couldn't blame my eyes or my fatigue. Something had actively blinded me in that classroom. Something had hidden the words from me, just to mess with my head. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was going completely insane. A few days later, the attacks shifted from psychological to physical. I had finished a morning class. It was around 10 a.m. The Saigon sun was already blistering, the kind of aggressive heat that makes the asphalt shimmer. I walked out to the university parking lot to get my motorbike. It was an old, heavy manual bike. The parking lot rules back then required you to kill the engine and push your bike out to the main gate before starting it, to keep the noise down. So, I grabbed the handles and pushed. It wouldn't budge. It felt like the tires had melted into the pavement. I pushed harder, leaning my entire body weight into it. The wheels slowly creaked forward, but it felt like I was trying to push a 2-ton boulder through wet sand. It was exactly like the brakes were completely locked, but I could see the brake lines were totally fine. I was sweating profusely, my muscles burning, panting like a dog. And right then, in the middle of this 100-degree heat wave, that damp, icy cold wrapped around me again. It slithered down my collar, freezing the sweat on my spine. My skin erupted in goosebumps. I was standing in direct sunlight, but I felt like I was locked in a meat freezer. I looked around, desperate, thinking some prankster students had messed with my bike, but the lot was mostly empty. A security guard saw me struggling and jogged over. I stepped back, panting, and told him my brakes must be jammed. The older man just grabbed the handlebars, casually pushed the bike forward with one hand, and it rolled perfectly smoothly. Not a single squeak of resistance. He looked at me like I was a fragile, hysterical woman, smiled, and even kicked the engine over for me. I thanked him, my cheeks burning with shame, and got on. I hit the throttle and shifted into first gear. The engine roared. The RPMs spiked, but the bike barely moved. I shifted to second, then third, then fourth. The engine was screaming, whining under the strain, but I was crawling forward at maybe 10 miles an hour. It felt like I was dragging a massive invisible anchor behind me. I was driving down the busy streets of Saigon, traffic honking and flying past me, while I moved at the speed of a dying bicycle. The sheer dread that washed over me is impossible to describe. I was terrified to look in my rearview mirrors. I had this sickening, gut-wrenching certainty that if I looked in those mirrors, I wouldn't see the empty seat behind me. I felt a heavy, oppressive presence pressing down on the back of the bike, weighing it down. It took me almost half an hour to drive a distance that usually took 5 minutes. The absolute worst part? The exact second I turned the corner onto my home street, away from the university, the weight instantly vanished. The bike shot forward, running perfectly normal. I had to slam on the brakes to avoid crashing into a wall. I locked myself in my house that day. I cried. I honestly just sat on my kitchen floor and cried because I felt so completely powerless. But the climax, the moment that truly broke me, happened a week later. I was determined not to let this unseen garbage bully me out of my job. I walked into the lecture hall, chest out, refusing to show fear. I greeted the security guard, chatted with a few students, my voice loud and crystal clear. I felt good. I stepped up onto the wooden podium. I opened my binder. The words were there. Perfect. I looked up at the class, took a deep breath, and opened my mouth to say good morning. The moment my lips parted, it felt like someone shoved a fistful of dry, jagged fiberglass down my windpipe. It wasn't a tickle. It wasn't a normal cough. It was a violent, suffocating blockage. My throat completely closed up. I gagged, my hands flying up to my neck. I tried to inhale, but all I could do was produce this pathetic, wheezing gasp. I started coughing so hard, my eyes watered. The students were staring at me in dead silence. I gripped the edges of the wooden podium so hard my nails dug into the varnish. My vision was blurring. I was staring hyper-fixated at a tiny chipped piece of laminate on the corner of the desk, watching a tiny bead of my own sweat drop onto it, while my brain just screamed, "Fucking hell, I'm going to choke to death right here in front of 50 kids." I couldn't speak, not a single syllable. Every time I tried to force air over my vocal cords, it felt like razor blades. I had to frantically write on the chalkboard, instructing them to do a silent reading exercise. For 45 agonizing minutes I stood there, silent, my chest heaving, tears of pain pricking my eyes. The second the bell rang, I grabbed my bag and bolted out the door. I took 3 steps into the outdoor hallway, and the blockage vanished. Just like that, my airway opened up. I took a massive, shuddering breath. My throat didn't even hurt anymore. I turned back to look into the empty classroom, and that familiar freezing draft washed over my face, as if something was standing right in the doorway, staring me down. They don't want me speaking. That was the chilling realization. Whatever was in that school didn't want me lecturing. I wasn't the only one suffering, either. My colleague, Hazel, the one who helped me at the buffet, confessed that she was being tormented too. She told me this deeply violating story about how she was lecturing in her traditional silk dress, the ao dai, which is quite thin, so naturally she wore a white undergarment beneath it. She was standing at the podium facing her class when she suddenly heard a loud, sharp snap. Something had violently yanked her bra strap from behind, pulling it so hard that the metal clasp actually broke. She said it stung her skin like a whip. She was absolutely terrified, staring at her 50 students, but they were all just quietly taking notes, completely oblivious. There was literally no one behind her. She had to spend the rest of that 2-hour lecture awkwardly pinning her arm against her side, walking sideways like a crab, too scared to turn her back to the chalkboard, until the room was empty and she could run to the bathroom to safety pin her clothes back together. A few days later, I finally broke down and talked to an older colleague, a man named Silas. I didn't tell him everything, just hinted that the campus felt heavy. Silas looked around nervously and told me that the week prior, he was teaching a literature class. Out of nowhere, a remarkably quiet, shy student named Arthur stood up, slammed his fists on the desk, and started screaming absolutely vile, aggressive obscenities at Silas. It was the kind of guttural rage that didn't fit the kid at all. Silas told me that before he could even react, Arthur just collapsed back into his chair, hitting his head on the desk. When he woke up a few seconds later, the kid started sobbing uncontrollably, completely unaware of what he had just done. He was hijacked from the inside. And it didn't just end in the classroom. Silas told me the administration actually called Arthur down to the principal's office using the campus loudspeakers. When the kid got there, he was completely disoriented, his face pale and exhausted like he had just woken up from a coma. When they interrogated him about the insults, Arthur just broke down sobbing, swearing he didn't do it. They even brought in the other female students to testify, and every single one of them confirmed that Arthur was the sweetest, most bullied kid in the class, and that the aggressive, raspy voice coming out of him earlier didn't even sound human. The poor kid was so traumatized by the disciplinary mark on his record that he ended up transferring schools shortly after. Hearing all this made my stomach turn. I needed to know what the hell we were dealing with. So, over the next few weeks, I started hanging around the cheap sidewalk cafes and canteens just outside the campus gates, buying iced coffee for the older locals who had lived in Bintan their whole lives. And they confirmed the nightmare. They told me that before the university was built, long before the government cleared it, that massive plot of land was an illegal, unmanaged graveyard. Because Saigon was a hub for migrants, poor workers who died far from their home provinces were just buried there in unmarked dirt. Hundreds of forgotten people, abandoned, with no families to burn incense or pray for them. When the city expanded, they just bulldozed over it to build the foundations of our school. We were walking on top of a massive, restless tomb. I realized then how naive I had been. I went to my church. I didn't ask for an exorcism, but I brought a small wooden rosary. I started keeping it in my teaching binder. I hung a small cross on my heavy motorbike. But more importantly, I changed my approach. During my breaks, I would walk around the empty edges of the courtyard. Alone, I would speak softly, not to anyone visible, but to the air. I told them that I acknowledged they were there. I told them I was a Catholic, so I couldn't offer them food or incense, but I promised to say a prayer for their peace every single day. I respectfully asked them to let me do my job, because this was my livelihood. I set a boundary, and slowly, the cold drafts stopped. The mechanical failures stopped. I could eat my food. I could speak. I survived my tenure there. But the absolute horror of it is that there is no resolution for that campus. Even now, almost 20 years later, I still hear the stories. Every single year, a new batch of fresh, skeptical graduates gets hired to teach at that university. And every single year, without fail, some of them experience the dropping temperatures, the invisible hands swatting their belongings, the choking fits. It's an endless cycle of trauma, because the dirt they are standing on still belongs to the dead. When I get the chance, I quietly pull those young teachers aside and teach them how to walk the courtyard and set their boundaries. I tell them straight up, if you're Buddhist, you need to go to your temple and ask the monks for a protective blessing, and if you're Catholic like me, I personally drag them to my church to get some guidance. But what about the ones I don't catch in time? What happens if one day a teacher reacts the wrong way, and instead of just choking them, the entities decide to pull a full Arthur on them? It makes me sick to my stomach just thinking about the sheer vulnerability of being completely sane, yet entirely at the mercy of something that defies all logic. Have any of you, especially those of you who work in old public buildings or schools, ever felt that specific, targeted drop in temperature, that sudden oppressive silence where your body just inherently knows you've crossed into someone else's territory? If you have, please tell me I'm not the only one who had to negotiate my sanity with an empty room. I read the comments. I really need to know I'm not crazy for believing this. I genuinely appreciate you sticking around to listen to an old teacher vent. Please, if you ever feel that unnatural cold creeping up your neck, don't ignore it. Just acknowledge it, keep your head down, and stay safe. Hopefully my nightmare saves you from yours. I'm done for tonight. I don't know if anyone listening to this has ever been, I guess the word is, sheltered. Like severely, almost dangerously sheltered, to the point where your brain literally doesn't know how to process a threat when it's staring you right in the face. If you have, or if you've ever experienced something so bizarre that your mind just tries to gaslight you into thinking it's normal, please let me know in the comments, because for the longest time, I thought I was just fundamentally broken. I really need to know I'm not the only one who reacts to pure terror with just dumb confusion. This happened back when I was in 10th grade. So, just to give you some context, my family was pretty well off. Actually, really well off. I'm not saying this to brag, but you have to understand my mindset back then. I was an only child, and my parents basically treated me like this fragile piece of glass. I was driven everywhere in a private car. I never had to walk the streets alone. I never really had to deal with conflict. I was bubble-wrapped. I was academically smart. But my emotional intelligence, my street smarts, they were basically zero. I was incredibly naive. So, I attended this massive international school in District 6, which is this area where you have these hyper-modern, sterile compounds right next to chaotic, noisy streets. I had been going there as a day student for about 2 years, and everything was fine. But then, I went through this mild rebellious phase. And when I say rebellious, I mean I probably just talked back to my mom once or twice, or stayed up a little late, and my parents completely overreacted. They decided I needed discipline, and forced me to become a boarding student at the exact same school. The crazy part was, my house was only about 3 miles away. I was living 3 miles away, but I was locked in this dorm. The boarding rules at this school were insane. It felt more like a minimum security prison than a high-end school. By 9 p.m. every single night, all the boarding students had to be in their assigned rooms. And these were big rooms, like 20 girls to a room, and each room had a dorm mother, basically a nanny who watched over us. I had the absolute worst luck and got assigned to Miss Quinn. She was this incredibly strict, no-nonsense woman who looked like she could snap a clipboard in half with her bare hands. The weirdest rule they had was about the bathrooms. At 9 p.m., you were locked in. The lights went out at 9:30 p.m. If you needed to use the restroom, Miss Quinn would ask everyone at 8:30 p.m., and she would literally herd us down the hall, into the elevator, down to the second floor where the big bathrooms were, and stand guard outside like we were toddlers. If you didn't go then, you held it until morning. There were no exceptions, no wandering the halls at night. At the time, we all complained about it. We just thought it was the school being overly controlling, a bunch of bureaucratic crap to keep us in line. We had no idea why the rule actually existed. So, it was a Tuesday night. At 8:30 p.m., Miss Quinn did her usual call for the bathroom. I was lying in my bed reading a magazine or something, and I didn't have to go. I was feeling lazy. The room was cozy, and I just couldn't be bothered to join the line. But of course, right around 10:14 p.m., I remember looking at the glowing red numbers on my digital alarm clock. It hit me, and it wasn't just a mild urge. It was this sudden, agonizing pressure, like my bladder was going to burst. I started tossing and turning, trying to ignore it, but it was impossible. I leaned over and whispered to my roommate that I needed to pee so badly I was in pain, and she just looked at me like I was dead meat, telling me that if I woke Miss Quinn up now, she would absolutely destroy me. I was lying there, sweating, trying to hold it, when a miracle happened. Around 10:19 p.m., Miss Quinn's cell phone buzzed. She answered it, whispering harshly, and from what I could gather, someone, maybe a relative or a delivery driver, was waiting for her down at the main gate. She sighed, grabbed her shawl, and slipped out of the room. And she didn't click the door completely shut. It was left open, just a crack. My brain instantly went into survival mode. But like, the dumb kind. I figured this was my only window. I would sneak out, take the elevator down to the second floor, pee in record time, and be back in bed before she even made it back up from the gate. I slipped out of bed, crept through the dark room trying not to step on anyone's shoes, and pushed out into the hallway. The fourth floor was dead quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, where the hum of the air conditioning sounds like a jet engine. I practically jogged to the elevator, pressed the button, and took it down to the second floor. I ran into the girls' bathroom. The facilities there were really nice. Everything was marble and chrome, and it always smelled intensely of artificial pine and bleach. I went into a stall, did my business as fast as humanly possible, flushed, and rushed out to the sinks. As I was washing my hands, I looked through the reflection in the mirror and noticed the bathroom door was propped open, and right outside in the hallway, there was a janitor. She was an older woman, wearing the school's maintenance uniform, which honestly looked more like a high-end hotel receptionist outfit, really crisp, dark blue, very professional. Her hair was pulled back into a tight ponytail, and she was slowly pushing a wet mop across the tiles. It was late, way past when the cleaning crew usually worked, but I was so panicked about getting caught by Miss Quinn that I didn't even process the timing. The school had this incredibly strict policy that students had to cross their arms and bow slightly to greet any staff member. Teachers, guards, janitors, didn't matter. But I was in such a rush, and I knew I wasn't supposed to be out of my room, so I just kept my head down, scurried past her without saying a word, and power walked to the elevator. I hit the call button. The doors slid open immediately. I stepped inside and jammed my finger against the button for the fourth floor, and then started aggressively tapping the door close button because I just wanted to get back to my bed. The heavy metal doors started to slide shut, and then they stopped. The sensors caught something, and they rolled back open. The janitor stepped into the elevator with me. She was still holding her mop, staring straight ahead at the metal doors. She didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge me. I felt a little guilty for not greeting her earlier, so I just pressed myself into the corner, staring at the floor indicator above the door. I had pressed 4. The little 4 button was glowing bright orange, but the elevator didn't go up. I felt that weird dropping sensation in my stomach as the mechanics kicked in, and the digital display flickered. Instead of going to 3, the arrow pointed down. The number changed to 1, and then down to G, for the ground floor. I remember frowning, thinking it was just a glitch, like maybe she had called the elevator from the ground floor before I got in, and the system was prioritizing her trip. My naive brain immediately started making up excuses for the machine. The elevator settled with a soft jolt at the ground floor. The door slid open to the dark lobby. The janitor stepped out, and this is the part where my brain should have sounded the alarm, but it didn't. As she walked out into the lobby, there was no sound. None. She was pushing a heavy industrial mop bucket and walking on hard marble floors, but there was no squeak of rubber soles, no sloshing water, no metallic rattling, just absolute dead silence. She moved with this slow, mechanical glide, almost like she was on a track. She stepped out, and the elevator doors slid shut behind her. I was alone again. I exhaled, feeling totally weirded out, and quickly pressed the button for the fourth floor again. The orange light glowed. The elevator hummed. The arrow pointed up, and we started ascending. Ground. First floor. And then the elevator stopped. It gave this dull ding, and the numbers locked onto the second floor. I groaned internally, thinking someone else was out past curfew. The door slowly parted, and my heart almost stopped. I was looking directly across the hallway at the open door of the girls' bathroom, and walking out of that bathroom, pushing her mop with the exact same slow, rhythmic motion, was the exact same janitor. She walked out of the bathroom, turned, and stepped right into the elevator with me. My mind just completely short-circuited. I was standing there, pressed against the cold metal wall, staring at the side of her face. It was her, the exact same crisp blue uniform, the exact same tight ponytail, the exact same grip on the mop handle. My brain, my incredibly sheltered, rationalizing brain, went into overdrive trying to build a logical bridge over this massive hole in reality. I literally told myself, I convinced myself in that moment, that she must have realized she forgot a cleaning spray or a sponge, and she had sprinted up the back stairwell to the second floor, grabbed it, and was now taking the elevator back down. I ignored the fact that no human being could climb 2 flights of stairs faster than an elevator. I ignored the fact that she wasn't breathing heavily, wasn't sweating, and looked completely undisturbed. I forced myself to believe the impossible physics because the alternative was something my mind couldn't handle. The doors closed, and once again, even though the 4th floor button was still glowing, the elevator went down. The arrow flipped. 2, 1, ground. The panic was starting to curdle in my stomach now. My mouth tasted like copper. I was gripping the handrail so tight my knuckles were white. This wasn't a glitch. Something was fundamentally wrong with the space I was in. The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened into the dim lobby. The janitor stepped out. I immediately started hammering the door close button. I didn't care anymore. I just wanted to be locked inside a metal box away from her. I was hitting the button so fast, over and over, my breath hitching in my throat, just begging the doors to shut, but they were slow. So agonizingly slow. I watched the janitor walk out through the narrowing gap of the doors. She took 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, and then she fell. But it wasn't a normal trip or a stumble. It was the most unnatural, horrifying collapse I have ever witnessed. Her body just gave out. It folded in on itself like a marionette with its strings violently severed. She hit the marble floor face first, and again, there was no sound. A human body hitting solid stone should make a sickening thud. The heavy metal mop handle bounced against the tiles, but it was completely mute. It was like I was watching a horrific video on mute. She lay there on her stomach, utterly motionless, but her arms were bent at these grotesque, impossible angles, reaching up towards her head in a frozen state of agony. The elevator doors were still open. I was frozen. This is where my upbringing actively fought against my survival instinct. Any normal person would have slammed the buttons, screamed, or ran. But my brain, programmed with years of etiquette and obedience, whispered to me that a school staff member had just collapsed, and it was my duty to help her. If I left her there, and Miss Quinn found out, I'd be expelled. My whole body was trembling. I was shaking so hard my teeth were clicking together, but I forced my legs to move. I took a step out of the elevator. I was maybe 2 feet away from her motionless body, reaching my hand out, trying to force my throat to form words to ask if she was okay, when a voice shattered the silence like a gunshot. "Tegan, what in God's name are you doing out of bed?" I jumped out of my skin. I spun around, and standing near the main entrance gates, holding a small plastic bag of what looked like medicine or food, was Miss Quinn. Her face was twisted in absolute fury. She started marching toward me, her heels clicking aggressively on the marble. She was demanding to know why I was on the ground floor at 10:30 at night, asking if I was trying to sneak out of the compound, completely ignoring the collapsed woman right in front of me. I was crying at this point. I was so overwhelmed by fear and the threat of trouble, I frantically pointed down at the floor, sobbing, trying to stammer out that the janitor had fallen, that she was hurt, that I was just trying to help her. Miss Quinn stopped in her tracks. She looked down at where I was pointing, and her expression changed from angry to utterly disgusted. She looked at me and asked what the hell I was talking about, telling me there was absolutely no one there, and that lying to get out of trouble was the worst offense I could commit. I snapped my head back to look at the floor. It was empty. The pristine, polished marble floor was completely fucking empty. No janitor, no mop, no bucket, not even a smudge of water on the tiles. It was just nothing. I couldn't speak. My vocal cords literally stopped working. I just stood there with my mouth open, staring at the empty space, my brain collapsing in on itself. Miss Quinn didn't care. She grabbed my arm, pinching my ear just a little to assert dominance, and physically dragged me back into the elevator. She hit the button for the 4th floor, and of course, this time, it went straight up. Normal. Flawless. She marched me back to the dorm, shoved me into my bed, and told me I was getting a massive detention in the morning. I didn't care about the detention. I pulled my blanket up to my nose and lay there in the dark. There were 19 other girls sleeping soundly all around me, breathing softly, and I had never felt more isolated in my entire life. I didn't sleep a single wink. I just lay there, tears continuously streaming down the sides of my face, soaking into my pillow. I was trapped in this paralyzing loop of terror, unable to pray, unable to rationalize, just marinating in the absolute horror of what I had seen. I stayed completely rigid until the sun came up at 6 a.m. The second recess hit, I practically sprinted to the school's payphones. I used whatever change I had, called my mom, and the moment I heard her voice say hello, I completely broke down. I was screaming, crying, begging her to come get me, acting like a complete maniac. Because we lived so close, my parents were at the school gates in less than 20 minutes. They stormed into the administration office, pulling the wealthy, angry parent card, demanding to know what happened to me. They pulled my homeroom teacher into the meeting. And the teacher, she looked exhausted. She didn't try to gaslight me. She didn't say I was hallucinating. She sat my parents down and explained that about a decade ago, right after the school had been built, there was a janitor who worked the late shifts. One night, while cleaning the second-floor bathrooms, she felt unwell. She took the elevator down to the ground floor to seek help from the security guards, but as she stepped out of the elevator, she suffered a massive, fatal stroke. She collapsed right there in the lobby and died before the ambulance even arrived. The teacher explained that what I saw wasn't a ghost trying to attack me. I had just, somehow, for whatever reason, tuned into a residual loop. I had witnessed the last 3 minutes of that poor woman's life, playing out over and over again like a broken VHS tape. My parents didn't even wait for the end of the day. They packed up my room, withdrew my enrollment, and transferred me to a completely different day school in another district by the end of the week. But here's the thing that still keeps me up at night. The thought that completely ruins me even years later. What if Ms. Quinn hadn't shouted my name when she did? I was inches away from touching her. My hand was reaching out to grab her shoulder, to pull her up. If I had made physical contact with that echo, what would have happened? Would my hand have passed right through her empty air? Or worse, would I have been pulled into her loop? Would I be stuck in that sterile, silent elevator, riding down to the ground floor, watching her die, over and over and over again for the rest of eternity? I still live in the city, and occasionally, I have to drive past District 6 at night. Every time I see the lights of that international school glowing in the distance, I immediately lock my car doors, and my hands start sweating against the steering wheel. I have this irrational terror that if I stop at a red light too long, I'll look over at the crosswalk and see a woman in a crisp blue uniform pushing a dry mop across the asphalt in dead silence. I don't know if anyone is actually going to listen to this all the way through, but I just really need to get this out of my head. It's been bothering me for a long time. This happened way back in 2009, so what, like 16 or 17 years ago now? I was just a kid. Middle school? 8th grade? Wait, no, 9th grade. Yeah, it was my final year of middle school. We lived down in this rural area, and my school was situated right on the edge of the main provincial road. It was this dusty 2-lane stretch that felt more like a death trap crawling with cargo trucks and reckless drivers than an actual road. I need to explain how things were back then just so this makes sense. Every morning, like clockwork, my dad would drive me to school on the back of his old rattling motorbike. The air always smelled like this nauseating mix of damp earth, morning dew, and heavy diesel exhaust. It was a loud, chaotic commute. But this one morning, it was different. We were maybe a few hundred yards away from the school gates when traffic just ground to an absolute halt. You know that heavy, thick feeling in the air when a crowd gathers? It was like that. There were people everywhere, swarming around the front of this massive idling cargo truck. And the smell. I'll never forget the smell. Before I even saw anything, this hot, sweet metallic stench of copper just forced its way into my nose, and it made my stomach churn because, even as a kid, your brain just instantly registers that smell as blood. A lot of it. My dad, bless him, he panicked. He knew immediately what had happened, and he just threw one hand back to cover my eyes while trying to steer the bike with the other, just aggressively muttering for me to keep my eyes shut and not look down. So I didn't. I kept my eyes squeezed shut. But you can't close your ears, you know? As we slowly navigated through the edge of the crowd, I could hear the local moms and the street vendors just wailing. They were screaming about some guy, crying out to the heavens about how his poor wife and little kid were waiting at home, how his body was just completely crushed flat by the tires. It was awful. Just listening to them detail the gore made me feel sick to my stomach. But from the context of their crying, I figured out pretty quickly that the victim was an adult, a family man, which gave me this twisted, selfish wave of relief, because it meant it wasn't one of my classmates. Dad dropped me off at the school gate, looking totally pale, and just told me to go straight to class. I walked into the schoolyard, and the contrast was just jarring. Outside the gates, there was a literal mangled corpse on the asphalt, but inside, the sun was shining, kids were laughing, kicking a shuttlecock around, totally oblivious. I got there pretty early, so there was still a lot of time before the first bell. I was just wandering around the yard, trying to shake off the smell of the copper, when I noticed this kid from my grade. Let's call him Corbin. He wasn't in my homeroom. I was in Section A. He was in Section B, I think. But everybody knew him. He was the classic troubled kid. Came from a really poor, tough background. Parents were never around. And he was always starting fights, getting called into the principal's office, or sneaking out to the filthy back bathrooms to smoke cheap cigarettes with his buddies. He was just that guy. But that morning, Corbin was acting incredibly strange. He wasn't with his usual crew. He was just sitting by himself on this concrete bench near the flower beds, and he looked entirely unhinged. I mean, he was pacing, then sitting, then pacing again. He was sweating bullets, even though it wasn't that hot yet. His eyes were darting everywhere, looking over his shoulder, staring at the shadows, just radiating this intense, paranoid energy. I remember staring at him, and my brain immediately started trying to rationalize it, you know? I was just telling myself, oh, he probably stole a test answer sheet or something. No, wait, we didn't even have midterms that week. Okay, then he probably snuck a pack of smokes in and was terrified the hall monitors were going to bust him. Yeah, that had to be it. I completely dismissed the weird, icy feeling in my gut and just walked away when the bell rang. The first 3 periods dragged on forever. It was probably an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, of just agonizingly boring lectures. The heat of the day started baking the classroom walls, and the incident from the morning was pushed to the back of my mind. Then came the mid-morning recess. The bell rang, and hundreds of us just poured out into the courtyard. It was loud, chaotic, totally normal. We were out there for maybe 5, maybe 7 minutes max. And then, someone shrieked. It wasn't a playful scream. It was this shrill, guttural noise that instantly made the entire courtyard go dead silent. Some kid was pointing up at the main building, screaming that Corbin had completely lost his mind and climbed the roof. I looked up, and my heart just dropped into my shoes. Our main building was 3 stories high, topped with these steep, slippery red clay tiles that practically burned in the sun. And right there, at the very peak of the roof, was Corbin. He was clinging to the rusted metal lightning rod with one arm, just dangling dangerously close to the edge. But that wasn't the screwed up part. The screwed up part was what he was doing with his free hand. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't threatening to jump. He was just beating himself. He had his hand pulled back, and he was ruthlessly, violently smashing his own palm into his face. I couldn't hear what he was muttering, because he was too high up, but the sound of his hand hitting flesh, it echoed down into the courtyard. It was this sickening, rhythmic smack, 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 just echoing, over and over. It didn't even look like his own arm was doing it. It looked like someone else was operating his limb, forcing him to punish himself. The whole yard was in a frenzy. Some idiot kids were cheering him on, calling him a boss for defying the teachers, while the rest of us were just standing there paralyzed, thinking we were about to watch a kid fall 3 stories and break his neck on the concrete. The teachers were panicking, running around like headless chickens, until our gym teacher, let's call him Coach Tucker, pushed through the crowd. Coach Tucker was this massive, heavily built guy, completely athletic. He didn't hesitate. He found the maintenance trellis and started climbing up the side of the building. But watching Coach Tucker climb is what broke my brain, because it took him a long time. It took this fit, muscular adult man a solid 5 to 7 minutes of careful, agonizing maneuvering to reach the edge of the roof. And as I watched him struggle, a realization hit me that made me feel physically sick. Recess had only started a few minutes ago. Corbin had been sitting in the classroom right up until the bell rang. How the hell did a scrawny 14-year-old kid scale a 3-story building, navigate a slippery slanted tile roof, and reach the absolute highest peak in under 3 minutes? It was physically impossible. It defied every law of physics. When Coach Tucker finally hauled himself onto the roof, we all expected him to just tackle Corbin and drag him down. But he didn't. Instead, Coach Tucker carefully shimmied over, grabbed Corbin by the wrist to stop him from hitting himself, and then he just sat down. He sat cross-legged on the slanted tiles, right next to the kid clinging to the lightning rod, and he just started talking to him. They sat up there for what felt like an eternity. Just 2 figures silhouetted against the blinding morning sun, having a conversation on the edge of a sheer drop. The recess bell rang, and the principal rushed out, shouting at us to get back inside, herding us into our classroom so we wouldn't witness whatever was about to happen. I got back to my desk, sitting right by the window, and I couldn't focus on anything. I just kept glancing up at the roof. 10 minutes passed, then 20. They were up there for almost half an hour. Finally, I saw movement. 2 other maintenance guys had gotten up there with a ladder, and they were lowering Corbin down. But he wasn't walking. He was completely limp. Coach Tucker basically had to sling the kid over his shoulder, supporting his dead weight while the others guided his legs. Corbin had passed out cold. They rushed him to the nurse's office, and a while later, I saw his estranged parents arrive at the gate to haul him home. That was it. The school went on lockdown about the rumors. Nobody knew what was set up there. For days, Corbin didn't show up to school. When he finally came back, they marched him straight into the principal's office. It was like a tribunal. The principal, the disciplinary committee, the homeroom teachers, they all surrounded him, interrogating him. But Corbin didn't say a single word to us. When he got back to class, kids were hounding him, asking why he climbed the roof, asking if he was trying to end it all. He just kept his mouth shut, staring at his desk with these dead, hollow eyes. He knew if he told the truth, they would expel him permanently. But you can't keep a secret in a small town. Teachers are just regular people once they clock out, you know? They go to the local food stalls, they drink beer, they gossip. And eventually, the truth spilled out from Coach Tucker himself, who told the local guys, who eventually told my dad. When Coach Tucker got up on that roof, he said the first thing he noticed was the blood. Corbin's mouth was a ruined mess. The kid had been slapping himself with such horrific, inhuman force that he had literally knocked 3 of his own front teeth completely out of his gums. Coach Tucker had grabbed the kid's arm and yelled at him to stop, threatening him with expulsion. He thought it was just Corbin being a rebellious punk. But then he looked into Corbin's eyes. Coach Tucker said the eyes looking back at him, they weren't the eyes of a 14-year-old boy. They were old, tired, and full of absolute rage. And then Corbin stopped struggling, tilted his bloody chin up, and spoke. But the voice that came out of his throat wasn't his. "It's his fault," the voice snarled, pointing a shaking, bloody finger at Corbin's own chest. "It's this little bastard's fault. He took my phone. Nobody could call anyone. He made me lie there on the burning asphalt, baking in the sun. For 3 whole hours, he just left me there like a crushed dog. Because of him, my wife didn't know. He took my phone. Coach Tucker was frozen. He asked the kid who he was talking about. Corbin's face twisted into this grotesque sneer. "It's me, Tucker. You don't recognize me? It's Seth. The truck got me this morning. I'm dead, Tucker, and this little thief stole my phone so I couldn't even get a proper covering. He shoved it in his pocket." Coach Tucker said he felt his heart completely stop, because Coach Tucker hadn't seen the accident that morning. He had come to school through a different route, but he knew a guy named Seth. In fact, he had been drinking beers with a 27-year-old guy named Seth just the night before. Terrified, Coach Tucker patted down Corbin's uniform pants, and right there, deep in the kid's pocket, his fingers brushed against cold, cracked plastic. He pulled it out. It was an old, cheap flip phone. The screen was shattered. The casing was scuffed from being dragged on the pavement, and it was completely coated in dried, sticky blood. The story finally came together. Corbin hadn't just been acting weird that morning because he walked to school alone. He was one of the very first people to witness the accident. He was standing maybe 30 feet away when the cargo truck obliterated Seth. And when the chaos started, before the crowd could fully form, Corbin saw Seth's cheap little phone skitter across the pavement, coming to a stop near a pool of blood. Corbin was just a dumb broke kid. He didn't even want the phone to use it. He just figured he could wipe the blood off and sell it to a repair shop for maybe 10 or 15 bucks. Just enough cash to buy some arcade tokens and a pack of cigarettes. So, in a moment of pure selfish greed, he swiped the dead man's phone, shoved it in his pocket, and ran to school to hide. Because of that, because Seth had left home without his wallet that morning to grab breakfast, he had no ID on him. When the slow rural ambulance and police finally arrived, they couldn't identify the body. They couldn't call his pregnant wife. Seth's mangled corpse was left lying on the sweltering highway for 3 hours while the cops tried to figure out who he was. And Seth's spirit, his spirit followed the phone. He followed the greedy little kid who stripped away his dignity just to play some video games, and he decided to make him suffer. Coach Tucker spent 20 minutes sitting on that roof, pleading with the ghost of his drinking buddy. He had to beg Seth to let the boy go, explaining that Corbin was just a stupid, impoverished kid who made a terrible mistake. It took almost half an hour of negotiating with a dead man before Seth finally let out a heavy sigh. Corbin's eyes rolled into the back of his head, and the kid just collapsed, completely empty. The school hushed it up. They let Corbin stay, under the strict condition that he never utter a word about what he stole. Man, thinking back on it now, it just completely messes with my head. I can't stop thinking about what would have happened if my dad hadn't driven me that morning. What if I had been walking to school? What if I had seen that phone on the ground, shining in the sun, and my stupid kid brain decided to pick it up just to see if it worked? Would I have been the one on that roof, shattering my own teeth? Have any of you guys ever seen anything like this? Has anyone ever witnessed a possession that was triggered by stealing from an accident? I just need someone to tell me I'm not crazy for being so terrified of the dead. Anyway, if you actually listen to this whole mess, thank you. Seriously, please, if you're ever walking by a tragedy, just keep your hands to yourself and keep walking. This was back in 2014. I had just finished high school, fresh out of the countryside, packing my entire life into a couple of duffel bags to head up to college in Saigon. I was 18, naive, and completely broke. Now, I had this buddy from my hometown, an older guy who lived a few streets down from me. Let's call him Keegan. Keegan was 3 years ahead of me, already a junior in college, and he had kind of taken me under his wing. Whenever he came back home to visit, I'd ask him about the city, how to survive, where to go. He always played the big brother role, telling me not to worry, saying he'd sort out a rental room for us so I wouldn't have to cram into the miserable campus dorms. My parents even called him before I left, asking him to look out for me, show me the ropes. He agreed. Everything was supposed to be set. So, my mom drops me off for the final time. I meet up with Keegan, and we're riding his beat-up motorbike through the endless traffic. I'm holding onto my bags, sweating through my shirt, and I finally ask him, "Hey, so, where's this place we're staying?" Is it close to campus? And I swear to you, the guy just chuckles over the roar of the engine and goes, he just casually mentions that he has absolutely no idea where we're sleeping tonight. I thought he was messing with me. You know how older guys haze the freshmen. I told him to quit playing and give me the address so I could pull it up on my phone. But he wasn't joking. He told me that he'd gotten into a screaming match with his landlord the day before, got kicked out, dumped all his stuff at another buddy's place, and we were essentially homeless. His brilliant plan was for us to crash on his friend's floor for a few days while we went hunting for a new apartment. He actually tried to spin it like a fun rite of passage. I was so pissed, but what could I do? I was miles away from home with nowhere to go. We ended up sleeping on a dirty tile floor that night, got incredibly drunk on cheap beer to celebrate my arrival, and woke up the next morning feeling like absolute garbage. It was maybe 9 in the morning, the sun was already baking the pavement, and we dragged ourselves onto his bike to hunt for a room. Man, we looked everywhere. We were specifically looking for student housing because it's cheaper, but every place was either completely full, insanely overpriced, or looked like a literal crime scene. We spent the entire day riding around, getting rejected, sweating, complaining about the heat, arguing with each other. By 4 in the afternoon, we were exhausted and desperate. We were riding down this major road toward Thuduk. This is an industrial, dusty outskirt district where the city limits start bleeding into nothingness. We were stopped at a red light, and you know how people just plaster cheap flyers on the telephone poles? Well, Keegan spotted one. It was a handwritten ad for a room to rent, incredibly cheap, and apparently, it was only a few blocks away. Keegan didn't even want to go look. He was whining about how it was too far from our campus, that it would be a 5-mile commute every day. But I was so completely done with being homeless that I begged him to just turn the bike around and check it out. We pulled into this really narrow, claustrophobic alleyway, the kind where the sun barely hits the ground and the walls are covered in moss and peeling posters. But when we found the actual building, it was surprising. It was a small boarding house, and it looked brand new. Like, when we walked in, I could still smell the fresh paint and the drywall compound. It was pristine. We asked the landlord about the price, and it was roughly $40 a month. For a brand new room with separate water and electricity meters, that was an absolute steal. It was absurdly cheap. We didn't even bother looking at the upstairs loft. We just threw down a deposit right then and there before anyone else could take it. I felt so smug. I remember bragging to Keegan the next day while we were moving our stuff in, telling him he should listen to the country kid more often. We spent the whole next afternoon hauling our bags inside. The layout was simple. A ground floor where Keegan decided to set up his sleeping mat, and a wooden loft upstairs where I was going to sleep. I hadn't even been up to the loft until we finished unpacking around 3 in the afternoon. When I finally climbed up the steep little ladder to check out my space, I noticed there was a single small window at the back of the room. It was shut tight, and right above the frame, slapped against the wall, was a faded yellow paper slip with red ink symbols on it. It was a warding seal, a talisman. Now, I didn't freak out. Where I grew up, people paced those things above their doors all the time to keep the drafty spirits out or bring good luck. It wasn't written in blood or anything dramatic. It was just a standard, dusty talisman. But it was hot up there, so I unlatched the window and pushed it open. And that's when my stomach dropped. When I opened that window, I wasn't looking at another alley or a neighbor's wall. I had a panoramic, unobstructed view of a massive, sprawling graveyard. It was right there. Our building was literally sharing a back wall with a cemetery, and it wasn't a small one either. It was a sea of concrete tombs, crosses, Buddhist stupas, just packed tightly together, baking in the dead afternoon sun. But the thing that immediately grabbed me, the thing you couldn't ignore, was this towering stone deity right in the middle of the graves. It was a massive stone statue of Ksitigarbha Bodhisattva. For those who aren't familiar with Buddhism, he's basically the ultimate savior of the underworld. He famously made this heavy vow saying, "If hell is not empty, I will not attain Buddhahood," swearing to stay in the darkest realms until every last soul is rescued. So, That's just a bit of lore I learned about him and wanted to share with you guys. Anyway, getting back to the story, this statue was standing maybe 15 feet tall. It had this stern, unblinking face, holding a staff, sheltered by this large, circular concrete canopy. It stood out because all the other graves were low to the ground, but this thing was just looming over everything. I slammed the window shut and practically fell down the ladder. I grabbed Keegan, panicking, telling him we screwed up, that we needed to get our money back because our room was literally sitting on top of a burial ground. He just laughed at me. He walked up there, looked out the window, and shrugged it off. He reminded me that we'd already paid 3 months' rent in advance, and then he mocked me for being scared. He told me that since he was sleeping downstairs, he didn't care what was out the window. I tried to act tough. I told him I wasn't scared, that I used to catch frogs in the cemetery back home. But man, I was terrified. Because of our different class schedules and his part-time job, Keegan and I rarely saw each other during the day. Sometimes we wouldn't cross paths for 2 or 3 days at a time. He'd leave before I woke up, and by the time I got back from my afternoon classes, the room would be empty. For the first week, everything was fine. A completely normal, boring week. I'm a smoker, so I'd occasionally open that window just a crack to blow the smoke out, but otherwise, I kept it locked. Then, the trial period ended. That's the best way I can describe it. Whatever was out there decided it was time to introduce itself. It started with the dogs. I'd get home around 5 in the evening, the sun starting to dip, the room casting these long, weird shadows, and I started hearing dogs barking. Not just one, but a pack of them, and it wasn't a normal territorial bark. It was frantic, aggressive. The first day I ignored it, but it kept going, giving me a massive headache, so I cracked the window to look out. Down in the graveyard, right around the base of that massive stone deity, there were 4 stray dogs, scrawny, mangy things, and they were just screaming at the statue. They were looking up at it, baring their teeth, backing away, and then lunging forward. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself that dogs are stupid. They probably couldn't tell the difference between a giant imposing statue and a real person. Maybe the face of the deity spooked them. It was annoying, but whatever. I closed the window, but it happened the next day, and the day after that. And by the 4th day, I realized something really screwed up. They weren't barking at the statue itself. They were tracking something on the statue. You know how a dog follows a laser pointer? Or a squirrel running along a fence? These dogs were running in circles around the base of the monument, their heads tilted up, barking at something that was slowly moving around the canopy. I strained my eyes, looking for a stray cat or a rat up there, but the concrete roof was completely empty. There was nothing, but the dogs were tracking something. Later that week, and I need to preface this by saying I was a dumb, broke kid who made questionable choices. Keegan and I went out to get some food. Down the main street from our alley, there was this older lady who ran a sketchy underground street food cart. She sold dog meat. It's a dark, taboo part of the culture, and I'm not proud of it, but it was incredibly cheap meat, and we were drinking. We sat there, ate the stew, drank some awful rice wine, and went home. The very next afternoon, I was up in the loft, and the barking started again. I opened the window, annoyed, and saw the same 4 dogs running their chaotic circles around the statue. I closed the window and laid down. Maybe 10 minutes later, the barking turned into this vicious, guttural snarling. They were fighting. I opened the window again and saw a massive dust cloud kicking up among the tombstones. The 4 dogs were just tearing into each other, ripping at throats, yelping. It was a bloodbath. I couldn't do anything to stop it. They were way too far out, and there was a wall between us. I remember actually thinking to myself, in a really dark, sarcastic way, that if they killed each other, the old lady down the street was going to have a field day picking up the inventory. I shut the window. Eventually, the noise stopped. Just dead silence. The next morning, I woke up early. I grabbed a cigarette, cracked the window, and looked out toward the statue. The dogs were dead. All 4 of them. But it wasn't the fact that they were dead that made my blood run cold. It was how they were dead. When animals fight to the death, They drop where they drop. It's messy. But these 4 dogs, they were lined up perfectly, side by side, snout to tail, lying in a flawless, horizontal row right at the foot of the deity, like someone had measured the distance between their bodies. I stared at them for a long time. From that distance, I couldn't see any blood, but their tongues were lolling out, and they were stiff. My brain instantly went into overdrive trying to gaslight myself. I told myself it was poison. Someone in the neighborhood got sick of the noise, threw poisoned meat over the wall, and then what? Climbed the fence and arranged the corpses as a sick prank? It made absolutely no logical sense, but I forced myself to believe it because the alternative was too horrifying to process. When Keegan got home that night, I told him about the dead dogs. He immediately got greedy. He wanted me to point out where they were so he could go bag them and sell them to the street vendor. But when we opened the window to look, the bodies were gone. Just vanished. We figured the city sanitation guys, or maybe the vendor herself, had already scooped them up. I felt uneasy, but life went on. A few days passed. I was eating breakfast at a noodle stand near the alley entrance. The woman running the stand was gossiping with a customer, and I overheard them. The vendor was whispering about the old lady who sold the dog meat. She said the lady had found 4 freshly dead dogs in the graveyard a few mornings ago and dragged them home to cook. But the vendor also mentioned a rumor. Some guy walking home late at night claimed he saw a little boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, riding on the back of one of the stray dogs through the tombstones, laughing, right before the dogs all dropped dead. I stopped chewing. My stomach tied itself into a knot. I tried to push it out of my mind. It was just neighborhood gossip. Superstitious nonsense. That night, Keegan and I went out drinking again. We got pretty hammered. We stumbled back to the room around 10. He passed out on his mat downstairs, and I crawled up into the loft, my head spinning. Sometime deep in the night, I don't know the exact time, must have been around 3:11 or 3:15 a.m. I woke up with a full bladder. I climbed down the ladder, used the bathroom, and climbed back up. I wasn't sleepy anymore, so I decided to have a smoke. Keegan hated the smell of smoke, so I had to be careful. I quietly unlatched the window, opened it wide, and leaned my head and shoulders all the way outside so the smoke wouldn't drift down to him. The graveyard was pitch black, except for the ambient orange glow of the city, reflecting off the low clouds. I took a drag, blew it out, took another. Everything was dead silent. On my 4th drag, I exhaled a thick cloud of smoke. I watched it drift lazily out into the humid air, curling and thinning out. And as the smoke cleared, my eyes adjusted to the canopy of that giant stone deity, standing right on the very peak of the concrete roof, maybe 40 feet in the air, was a little boy. He looked about 7 or 8. He was just standing there, one hand resting on his hip, the other hanging limp by his side. My brain completely stalled. I thought I was hallucinating from the cheap booze. I rubbed my eyes hard and looked again. He was still there, and he wasn't completely still. He was swaying slightly, his head tilting from side to side, and even though I couldn't make out his facial features in the dark, I could feel the weight of his stare. He was looking directly at my window. A kid, 40 feet up in the air, in a graveyard, at 3 in the morning. Panic hit me like a physical blow. I threw the cigarette into the dark, scrambled back inside, and practically threw myself down the ladder. I was shaking Keegan, screaming at him to wake up, telling him there was a kid stuck on top of the statue and he was going to fall and die. Keegan groaned, swearing at me, telling me I was a drunk idiot. But I dragged him out of bed and shoved him toward the ladder. I was maybe 2 steps behind him as he climbed up. He reached the loft, looked out the open window, and turned back to me, furious. He told me there was absolutely nothing out there. I pushed past him and looked. He was right. The canopy was empty. Keegan unleashed on me. He cursed me out, telling me I was losing my mind, that he had to be up for work in 3 hours and I was ruining his life with my drunken paranoia. He turned around and started climbing back down the ladder. He was halfway down. Only his torso and head were still visible in the loft. I glanced back toward the window to close it, and my heart completely stopped. The kid wasn't on the statue anymore. He was sitting on the top step of the ladder, right next to the opening where Keegan was climbing down. He had covered a distance of maybe 50 yards in less than 3 seconds. He was sitting there, swinging his little legs over the edge, kicking them back and forth in the air like a toddler on a swing set. He had his hands planted on the wood, leaning forward, and his head was bobbing as he stared right at me. I couldn't breathe. I tried to scream Keegan's name, to tell him to look back, but nothing came out of my throat. I just managed this pathetic squeak. Keegan grumbled something about me being a psycho and disappeared down the stairs. I blinked, and the kid was gone, just dissolved into the air. I slammed the window shut, locked it, and threw myself onto my mattress. I pulled the thin blanket all the way over my head. I was shivering so violently I thought my teeth were going to crack. I absolutely knew, that I had just seen a ghost. There was no rationalizing it anymore. I lay there for what felt like hours, sweating through my clothes, paralyzed by this primal, suffocating fear. Eventually, the sheer exhaustion from the alcohol dragged me into a light, broken sleep. I don't know how long I was out, maybe 45 minutes. I woke up because something cold clamped down on my big toe. And then, snap. It pulled my toe hard enough to pop the joint. The sound was so loud in the quiet room, my eyes shot open. I looked down toward the foot of my mattress, which was right next to the opening for the ladder. There was a head slowly rising up from the stairwell. My immediate thought, my desperate defense mechanism, was that it was Keegan. I thought Keegan had come back up to scare me for waking him up earlier. I tried to keep my voice steady. I told him that it wasn't funny, that I wasn't scared, and he needed to go back to sleep. The head dipped back down out of sight. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I closed my eyes again. 3 minutes later, snap. My middle toe was yanked, hard. I opened my eyes, and the head was peeking up over the edge again. I sat up slightly, my voice trembling now. I told Keegan to stop. I begged him to stop. It went back down. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting. Then, it grabbed my big toe again, and this time it jerked my entire leg forward. I snapped. I threw the blanket off and bolted upright, and I completely froze. Sitting right at the top of the ladder, bathed in the faint, sickly light filtering through the window, was the boy. He was sitting in this tight little ball, his knees pulled up to his chest, his arms wrapped around them. He was sitting completely still. His skin had this awful grayish-blue tint to it. I couldn't look at his face. My brain literally wouldn't let me. I found myself staring at a small chip in the paint on the floorboards right next to his bare foot. I just stared at that chip of paint, unable to move, unable to blink. We sat there in silence for maybe 4 seconds. It felt like an eternity. And then, he spoke. His voice didn't echo. It didn't sound ethereal. It just sounded like a normal, flat, emotionless kid. "Is the meat good?" he asked. I couldn't answer. "Is the meat good?" he repeated. I caught them. They were barking too loud. They gave me a headache. I caught them. "Is the meat good?" He just kept repeating it, mumbling it over and over. I caught them. I caught them. "Is the meat good?" Then, he stood up. He didn't vanish this time. He turned around and slowly, deliberately, started walking down the ladder. I watched his head sink lower and lower until he was completely gone. I absolutely lost my fucking mind. I screamed so loud I probably woke up the entire block. I pressed myself against the farthest wall and just wailed for Keegan. Keegan rushed up, furious, but when he saw me crying, hyperventilating, pressing myself into the corner like a trapped animal, his anger sort of faded into confusion. I spilled everything to him. The kid, the teleporting, the toes, what he said about the dogs. Of course, Keegan didn't believe the supernatural part, but he realized I was having a complete mental breakdown. He stayed up with me until the sun came up. The next morning, neither of us wanted to stay in that room. We went out to grab breakfast to clear our heads. We walked past the alley where the dog meat vendor set up her stall. She wasn't selling anything that day. Instead, she had set up a massive folding table on the sidewalk. There was a Buddhist monk standing there in his robes, chanting. and lying on a tarp behind the table, covered by a cloth, were two of the dead dogs from the graveyard. They were stiff, completely untouched, waiting to be buried. I asked the lady running the breakfast stall what was happening. She leaned in and whispered that the meat vendor was being haunted. She said the vendor had been having nightmares for days, a little boy pulling at her clothes, demanding payment. But last night, while her husband was out of town, she woke up to find the boy standing right beside her bed. He was screaming at her. He told her that he was the one who caught the dogs, that they were his kill, and she had stolen them to sell without giving him his cut. He demanded payment for his work. She was so terrified she hired a monk at dawn. They had to go into the graveyard to find the source, and they found it. It was a small, neglected grave of a young boy who had died a few years prior. And the reason he killed those dogs, when they found his grave, the headstone and the plot were completely covered in dog feces. The stray dogs had been using his grave as a toilet for weeks. He got sick of it, snapped their necks, and lined them up as a warning. And because we ate the meat, because the vendor sold the meat, we became part of the transaction. We owed him. Keegan finally believed me. He went completely pale. We moved out of that boarding house 3 days later and absorbed the loss of our deposit. It's been over a decade, but I still can't shake it. You know what the worst part is? It's the lingering paranoia. Every time I go to sleep, I cannot leave my feet exposed. It's a physical impossibility for me. I have to meticulously tuck the heavy blanket under my heels, wrapping it tight around my ankles, no matter how hot the room gets. If I feel even a draft of air on my toes, my heart spikes, and I'm back in that loft, waiting for the joint to pop. I'm sorry for rambling on for so long. I just needed to get the details out exactly as I remember them. If you've stuck around this long, thank you. I really mean that. It feels a little lighter just having it out there in the world. If any of you ever find yourselves looking for a cheap place to rent and the price seems too good to be true, just check the windows. And seriously, whatever you do, if you hear dogs barking at nothing in the middle of the night, just keep walking. So, I grew up in this really rural part of the Mekong Delta. Miles of rice paddies, 0 streetlights, and a whole lot of empty space. Down there, schools aren't just down the block from each other. They are incredibly spread out. Like my elementary school, middle school, and high school were all miles apart from each other. It wasn't unusual to bike 6 or 7 miles on these bumpy dirt roads just to get to class. By the time I was a junior in high school, I had pretty much attended every campus in the district. I was this really sluggish, unmotivated kid back then, and my parents were getting sick of it. They essentially forced me to sign up for a martial arts class, karate specifically. I didn't want to do it, but a few of my buddies joined, so I just went along with it so I wouldn't be the only loser sitting at home. The classes were held in the high school courtyard from 5:30 to 7 p.m. I trained there for about half a year, and everything was completely mundane. Just sweat, sore muscles, and trying not to embarrass myself. But then the high school started this massive renovation project. By 4:30 p.m., when the final bell rang, construction crews would swarm the campus with cement mixers and scaffolding, completely taking over our training spot. So our karate teacher struck a deal with the principal of my old middle school, which was a few miles away. We temporarily relocated our evening classes there. I was actually pretty stoked about it, because the middle school was way closer to my house, saving me a ton of biking in the dark. For the first month, maybe 10 sessions in total, we practiced in the middle school courtyard. Now, you have to understand, I spent 4 years at this middle school. I knew every inch of it. My friends and I used to sneak in at night to steal mangoes from the trees out back, before the principal had them chopped down. It was my turf. It felt safe. I had 0 reason to feel creeped out. But then, I started noticing these weird behavioral shifts in our teacher. Usually this guy was incredibly passionate. He'd always keep us late, lecturing us about stances and discipline, completely ignoring the clock. But the moment we moved to this middle school campus, his entire demeanor flipped. Right around 6:30, maybe 6:45 at the latest, he would start looking over his shoulder. He'd rush through the final drills, clapping his hands and telling us to wrap it up, acting super antsy. He never let the class reach 7 p.m. It was always a frantic rush to dismiss us by 6:55. Once we were dismissed, we'd rip off our belts and run to our bikes. The teacher always insisted on putting away the heavy equipment, the floor mats, the kicking pads, by himself. He told us we were too messy and he wanted it organized, which sounded plausible at the time. But one evening my bike chain got jammed, so I was stuck in the parking area trying to fix it. I happened to look up and saw my teacher heading toward the equipment room. It was this old, detached storage room the school let him use. He looked ridiculous. He had these heavy mats shoved under his armpits and was speed walking, almost jogging, like he was terrified of being caught by someone. He fumbled with the keys, shoved the door open, practically threw the equipment into the pitch-black room, and slammed the door shut. Then, he did this thing that made my stomach drop. He put his hands together and bowed 3 times toward the closed door, like he was praying to a shrine. I just stood there with grease on my hands, completely bewildered. This was a tough, no-nonsense martial arts instructor, and he looked like a terrified child. I rationalized it, of course. I told myself maybe he was just superstitious about old buildings. You know how it is. Your brain will do anything to keep the bubble of normalcy intact. A few sessions later, the auditory stuff started. We were in the middle of a form, punching the air and yelling in unison. The campus was completely deserted except for us, 20 kids, the teacher, and an old security guard dozing in his booth up front. Right in the middle of our drill, there was this deafening bang. It sounded exactly like a heavy wooden classroom door being slammed shut with absolute maximum force. It echoed across the concrete courtyard so violently that all of us jumped. We stopped mid-punch. I looked at the teacher, and his face was completely drained of color. He looked sick, but he just waved his hands, forcing a laugh, and told us it was nothing, and to keep practicing. We tried to focus, but a few minutes later, crash! It sounded like someone had picked up one of those heavy wooden and iron school chairs and hurled it against a concrete wall. Just a sickening, violent thud. I actually stopped and asked the teacher if there was a bar fight going on at the pub down the street. I really wanted to believe it was just drunks, but the teacher snapped at me, telling me to mind my own business and keep punching. Over the next few weeks, it became a regular occurrence. 2 or 3 times a night, we'd hear heavy furniture scraping, doors rattling, and walls being hit. And my friends and I realized the sounds weren't coming from the street. They were coming from the equipment storage room, which was about 30 yards away from where we trained. Then came the belt testing week. Testing took a lot more gear, so the teacher had to bring extra mats and protective helmets. On the first night of testing, we finished up early, and the teacher actually asked this kid, let's call him Caleb, to help him carry the extra bags to the equipment room. The rest of us went to get our bikes. I was standing near the gate when I saw the teacher and Caleb walking toward the storage room, each lugging a massive duffel bag. They got to the door. The teacher started messing with the padlock. Suddenly, Caleb dropped his bag. Even from 40 yards away, I could see his entire body go rigid. Without a word, Caleb spun around and sprinted, and I don't mean he jogged away. I mean he ran like he was being hunted. He didn't even grab his bike. He sprinted full speed past me, his face a pale, twisted mask of absolute terror, and disappeared down the dirt road toward his house. The teacher didn't chase him. He just stood there, looking defeated. He eventually walked over to the security guard and the 2 grown men, one a tough athlete and the other a grizzled old man, had to buddy system their way back to the storage room just to throw the bags in. They did it in like 5 seconds flat, locked it, and practically speed walked away, sticking close together. I brushed it off. I figured Caleb was just being a weirdo. But Caleb didn't show up for the next session, or the one after that. On the final night of testing, classes ran late. It was past 7:15 p.m. when we finally finished. The teacher was visibly sweating, and he looked around frantically before pointing right at me. He told me to be a man and help him carry the gear to the storage room. My chest tightened. Every instinct told me to say no, but he was my teacher, and I wanted a good grade on my belt test. So, I grabbed the heaviest bag, and we started walking. He was walking a few paces ahead of me. As we got closer to the dark corridor where the storage room was, I realized he was whispering. I leaned in a bit, and I realized he was frantically mumbling some old Buddhist protection chant under his breath, over and over, like he was desperately begging whatever was in that room to spare us. My throat went completely dry. We got to the door. He unlocked it, shoved it open, and chucked his bag into the black void. He stepped back and told me to throw mine in and shut the door quickly, but my bag was awkwardly shaped and heavy. Instead of just throwing it, I stepped 1 foot inside the threshold of the dark room to push it securely against the wall so the door would close properly. I was bent over, shoving the canvas bag into the dark, and that's when I heard the voice. It was right in front of my face, inside the pitch-black room. A harsh, authoritative male voice. "What class are you in? Why do you look so unfamiliar? Who let you in here? Go back to your classroom immediately." My heart stopped. I honestly thought it was a joke. I thought my karate teacher was messing with me, but he was standing outside the door, behind me. I slowly tilted my head up into the darkness of the room. It was dark, but the figure standing there seemed to emit this dull, sickly luminescence. It was a man, and the absolute worst part was that I recognized him. It was a physics teacher. Let's call him Kale, who used to teach at this middle school when I was in 8th grade. He was a young guy, maybe early 30s. He was standing there in a dress shirt and these bizarrely high-waisted trousers that were yanked up almost to his ribs. But his white shirt wasn't white anymore. It was entirely saturated in dark, wet crimson. Blood was smeared all across his face in chaotic streaks, like he had been brutally beaten and slashed. He stood perfectly rigid, his arms pinned to his sides, his eyes bulging out of his skull, staring right through me. For about 4 seconds, my brain just broke. I was frozen, bent over my gym bag, staring at this mutilated phantom. Then, he started moving toward me, but he didn't walk. The room was cluttered with unused desks and massive 20-liter water jugs scattered on the floor. He didn't step over them. He just glided straight through the solid objects. He clipped right through a desk as he moved closer, his mouth moving, repeating those same aggressive questions over and over. "What class are you in? Go back to your room." He was maybe 5 feet away from me, and the smell hit me. This overpowering stench of old pennies and rotten meat. My body was completely paralyzed. Suddenly, a heavy hand swatted me hard right on the backside. It was my karate teacher. He smacked me, his voice shaking as he yelled at me to hurry up and shut the damn door. The physical shock of the hit broke my paralysis. I yanked myself backward out of the room. As I fell back, I saw Mr. Kale stop. He looked at me, and then he slowly drifted backward, receding into the oppressive blackness of the storage room until he just melted away into nothing. I grabbed the door handle and slammed it shut with all my body weight. I didn't say a word. I just bolted. I left my teacher standing there, jumped on my bike, and pedaled so hard I thought my lungs would burst. I got incredibly sick for a few days after that. High fevers, chills, the whole 9 yards. I kept having these suffocating night terrors where I was trapped in that room, and Kale kept gliding toward me, over and over again. When I finally broke down and told my parents what happened, my dad just sighed. He told me he thought I knew. Apparently, after I graduated to high school, Mr. Kale, who was a notoriously strict teacher, had expelled a horribly troubled 8th grader. A few weeks after being kicked out, that kid snuck back onto campus right as school was letting out. He ambushed Mr. Kale right in front of that equipment room. He pulled out a kitchen knife and stabbed his teacher dozens of times. Nobody could stop him in time. Kale bled to death right on the threshold of that storage door. He died a violent, angry death, betrayed by a student, and his spirit was just stuck there, forever patrolling the halls, trying to maintain order. When Caleb finally came back to classes weeks later, He confessed that he had heard the exact same voice. The worst part? Caleb actually used to hang out with the kid who committed the murder. When Caleb stood at the door, the ghost had called out his name, telling him not to be a delinquent, and warning him not to end up like his killer friend. The craziest piece of the puzzle? I found out later that our karate teacher actually knew the whole time. It was an open secret among all the local martial arts instructors in the district. They all knew that if you taught at that middle school, you had to clear out before 7 p.m., because after 7, Kale's spirit took over the grounds to enforce his own twisted, bloody curfew. That's why our teacher was always having a near panic attack trying to pack up and get us out of there by 6:55. It completely shattered my reality. I still can't open a door into an unlit room without my body rigidly locking up at the threshold. I literally have to stand there, hold my breath, and stare into the pitch black, just absolutely terrified that I'm gonna see a blood-soaked shirt gliding out of the shadows to ask me why I'm there. I don't know if any of you have ever had to uproot your entire life, right in the middle of middle school, but yeah, it's an absolute nightmare. I was around 13 or 14, 8th grade basically, when my parents decided we needed to pack up and move. The whole reason was just to be closer to our extended family, which, sounds great in theory, but it meant I was getting ripped out of my comfort zone and tossed into this entirely new environment. We moved to this really dense, suffocatingly humid district in the south. There were only 2 middle schools in the entire area, and, naturally, I got enrolled in the second one. It was only about maybe 6 or 7 miles away from my old school, but it felt like a different planet, and almost immediately, like before I even set foot on the campus, things got weird. My parents had some relatives over to help us unpack, and the adults were sitting around doing that low, hushed, whispering thing that parents do when they think you aren't paying attention. One of my aunts was practically interrogating my mom, asking why the hell she'd send me to that specific school. She was like offering to drive me back to my old school every single morning, saying it was worth the commute just to keep me out of this new place. My mom was just brushing it off, saying it was a logistical nightmare to drive that far, and that the new school was literally right down the street. But my aunt, she got this really grim look on her face. She leaned in, dropping her voice to this anxious mutter, telling my mom to warn me never to use the restrooms there. She was saying that years ago, some girl got brutally murdered in the stalls, and that the place was just wrong. Of course, my mom just rolled her eyes and told her to stop spouting superstitious crap. She didn't want me getting all worked up before my first day. But later that night, she still pulled me aside. She tried to play it cool, giving me this super awkward lecture about how I should just try to use the bathroom at home before school and hold it in until I got back. She made up some lame excuse about the school plumbing being bad, but I wasn't stupid. I had heard the whispering. I was just a kid, but I wasn't naive. I knew something was screwed up. A few days before the semester started, I managed to corner my older cousin, Dakota. She was like 25 at the time, and I knew for a fact she had gone to that exact same high school. Well, it was a combined middle and high school campus. I figured if anyone knew the actual truth, it was her. So I asked her about the rumors. I asked her why my mom was suddenly so obsessed with my bladder habits. Dakota just kind of froze. She gave this nervous, hollow little laugh, the kind you make when you're trying to deflect something genuinely upsetting. She tried to give me the standard adult runaround, telling me it was all ancient history and that the specific bathroom they were talking about had been shut down anyway. She told me I could pee wherever I wanted and that I'd be fine. But I kept pushing. I wouldn't let it go. And eventually, her whole demeanor shifted. She let out this long, exhausted sigh and sat me down. She told me that even just thinking about it gave her the chills because she had heard the real story straight from the seniors when she was a freshman. It wasn't just a ghost story. It was a tragedy, an incredibly ugly, filthy tragedy. Dakota told me about this girl. We'll call her Lila. Lila was an upperclassman back then, brilliant, top of her class, and unbelievably pretty. The kind of pretty that unfortunately draws a lot of unwanted attention in a small, gossipy town. There were all these nasty rumors flying around about her, people claiming she was flirting with older guys, even some whispers that a teacher was completely infatuated with her. You know how toxic high school environments can get, especially when jealousy gets thrown into the mix. People just hated her for existing. And then there was this other girl, Tessa. Tessa was the exact opposite. She was rough, physically intimidating, and her family was involved in some seriously sketchy stuff, like underground debt collection, mob-adjacent kind of things. Dakota told me that Tessa had developed this deep, venomous hatred for Lila. Maybe it was over a guy, maybe it was just pure envy. It didn't really matter. One day, right in the middle of a totally normal, quiet school day, maybe around 10:14 a.m. or something, the unthinkable happened. Tessa just snapped. She walked right into the principal's office, completely hysterical, her uniform completely drenched and covered in this disgusting brownish grime. She was sobbing uncontrollably, begging them to go check the girls' restroom at the end of the hall. Dakota said the faculty members who ran in there were scarred for life by what they saw. They found Lila on the floor of the last stall. Now, you have to understand the layout of these old local schools. The toilets aren't like normal Western ones. They're squat toilets. Just these porcelain troughs set straight into the floor, usually in these cramped, poorly lit stalls that permanently smell like ammonia and stagnant water. Lila was lying on her back, half inside the stall, her head draped backward right over the edge of the squat toilet. But the detail that makes my stomach tie into knots just thinking about it was her face. Her eyes were bulging out of her skull, completely bloodshot and rolled back, staring at the ceiling in pure, unadulterated terror. And her mouth was forced wide open, unhinged, and just completely stuffed with soiled, used toilet paper from the trash bins. Tessa had literally ambushed her, pinned her down on that filthy, wet tile, and shoved handfuls of used, feces-stained paper down Lila's throat until she suffocated to death. It wasn't a clean murder. It was visceral, it was degrading, and it was agonizingly slow. I could just imagine the wet, squelching sound of that paper being forced down her windpipe. The frantic kicking, the utter desperation as she drowned in pure filth. Lila was technically still warm when they found her, but she was gone. She died right there on those grimy tiles. Tessa was taken away to some juvenile detention center, and the school did what cheap, underfunded institutions do. They didn't demolish the building. They didn't even shut the bathroom down immediately. They just quietly cordoned off that specific stall, tried to scrub the tiles clean, and expected hundreds of traumatized teenagers to just go back to normal. But you can't just bleach away that kind of suffering. The energy of an agonizing death like that, it stains the foundation. Dakota told me that during her freshman year, which was right after it happened, the school was engulfed in absolute paranoia. The girls flat out refused to go near that end of the building, and the ones who were desperate enough to use the stalls next to the crime scene, they started experiencing things. They would be in the middle of doing their business, and suddenly, the atmosphere would just drop. The air would get freezing cold, heavy, like the atmospheric pressure in the room had just doubled. And then, from the empty stall next to them, the one Lila died in, they would hear a sudden thump. When they looked down at the gap under the partition, there would be a crumpled wet ball of soiled toilet paper sitting right there on the tiles, tossed over from an empty room. People tried to rationalize it. They really did. You know how the human brain works when it's confronted with the impossible. It violently rejects it. The girls would tell themselves that it was just some cruel prank by the seniors, or that a rat knocked the trash over, or whatever bullshit excuse they needed to tell themselves so they could finish washing their hands and sprint the hell out of there. But then, the auditory stuff started. Girls would be washing their hands, and they'd hear this muffled, frantic whimpering coming from the drain. Or worse, they'd hear Lila's voice, desperate and breathless, echoing off the tile walls. "No, Tessa, please. I didn't do anything. Please." It wasn't a memory. It was an active, real-time audio playback of a murder happening over and over again in the ambient silence of the restroom. By the time the next school year rolled around, the older kids had graduated or moved on, and a fresh batch of younger students came in, kids who didn't know the lore, kids who hadn't been warned. Dakota swore to me that the entity, whatever was left of Lila, got more aggressive when people didn't acknowledge her. There was this one incident that Dakota heard about from a junior. A younger girl had gone into the bathroom alone during class. She picked the very last stall, completely oblivious to the history. She locked the door, sat down, and suddenly, the lock mechanism jammed, just fused shut. The girl started panicking, jiggling the handle, but then the sound started, right inside the cramped 3x3 foot stall with her. She heard the distinct sound of a physical struggle, the wet slap of skin hitting wet tile, the heavy, ragged breathing of someone much larger pressing down, and then the shrieks. The girl was trapped in a locked box, listening to an invisible teenager being suffocated to death mere inches away from her face. She was screaming for help, pounding on the door, but the sounds just kept overlapping with her own cries. By the time a teacher heard her and came in, the stall door just popped open effortlessly. The poor kid was hyperventilating so hard she practically passed out in the hallway. But the story that truly scared the crap out of me, the one that made me decide I would rather rupture my own bladder than step foot in a public restroom, was about two 8th grade girls. They went to the bathroom together, the buddy system, like girls always do. One of them took the middle stall, and the other, let's call her Sarah, took the stall right next to the cursed one. The first girl finished up quickly, washed her hands, and yelled out that she was heading back to class. Sarah was still in her stall, dealing with feminine issues, and she just yelled back, asking her to wait. The bathroom went totally silent after the main door swung shut, just the slow, steady drip, drip, drip of a leaky faucet, echoing off the porcelain. Sarah was just sitting there, staring at the back of the door, when she heard a voice from the stall next to her. The empty stall. Did you get the notes for the next period? Sarah didn't even process it at first. She just assumed another student had walked in without the heavy main door squeaking. She replied, saying yeah, she had them in her notebook. The voice responded immediately. Can you pass them under the door? Sarah reached down to grab her bag, and as she did, she realized something. The voice, it sounded exactly like her best friend, the one who had just left. The exact same cadence, the exact same pitch, but with this weird, hollow resonance to it, like someone speaking through a long PVC pipe. Her stomach just instantly dropped. That primal instinct kicked in, that deep, evolutionary alarm bell screaming that she was in the presence of a predator. She didn't answer. She just scrambled to pull her clothes up, hands shaking so badly she could barely do her zipper. She unlocked her stall, practically throwing herself out into the main area, and rushed to the sinks. She just wanted to leave. She just needed to walk out the door. But her eyes caught the mirror, and in the reflection, she saw the door to the last stall slowly creaking open. Sarah turned around. She couldn't stop herself, and there she was. It was fucking terrifying. Sarah didn't see a translucent, glowing ghost. She saw a physical, tangible girl sitting on top of the squat toilet. Leela was crouched there, her knees pulled tight to her chest in this agonizing, defensive fetal position. She was wearing the standard school uniform, but it was ruined, drenched in dirty toilet water and splattered with old brown stains. Her hair was a matted, tangled mess, completely obscuring her face. But as Sarah stood there, completely paralyzed, Leela slowly tilted her head up. Her jaw was distended, completely dislocated, hanging open in this silent, agonizing scream, and her entire mouth was overflowing with a massive, sodden clump of dirty toilet paper. And her eyes were locked onto Sarah, bulging with a mixture of absolute fury and sheer unending panic. Sarah didn't even scream. Her brain just short-circuited. She fixated intensely on the rusted metal hinge of the stall door. She literally stared at the chipped green paint on the metal just to avoid looking at the corpse in front of her. She backed out of the bathroom blindly and sprinted down the hall until she collapsed in her classroom. After that, The rumors got too loud. Parents started complaining. Some parents even demanded the school bring in a priest to do an exorcism. But the administration, being this stubborn, secular entity, refused to acknowledge it was a haunting. They just claimed the plumbing was irreparably damaged. So, they shut it down. And I don't mean they locked the doors. I mean they brought in a maintenance crew and nailed thick, heavy wooden planks in a massive X across the entrance of the girls' restroom. And because the boys' restroom shared a wall and the same plumbing line, they boarded that one up too. That was the state of the school when I finally transferred there. I spent 3 years at that middle school. 3 long, exhausting years. They built a new restroom block on the opposite side of the campus, but to get to the cafeteria, you still had to walk past the old, boarded-up wing. I never saw Lila. I never saw an apparition or a shadow or anything like that, but I heard her. Every time I walked past those heavy wooden planks, if the hallway was quiet enough, I could hear it. From deep inside the pitch-black, sealed-off room, behind layers of concrete and wood. Thud. The sound of flesh hitting tile. The frantic scuffling of rubber soles squeaking against a wet floor. And that low, muffled gagging sound. The sound of someone drowning on dry land. I would just put my head down and walk faster, my heart hammering in my throat. I never told the teachers. I never told my friends. I just internalized that dread, letting it fester inside me until it became my normal. Looking back now, as an adult, it just messes with my head. I think about the sheer amount of energy it takes for a traumatic event to imprint itself onto a physical space like that. How much pain Leela must have felt in those final seconds for her soul to get trapped in an endless loop of her own murder. And the worst part? The thing that keeps me awake at 3 a.m. when the house is too quiet? I constantly think about the fact that the school didn't fix the problem. They didn't help her cross over. They just trapped her in there. They nailed a piece of wood over a gaping wound and walked away. What happens when those boards eventually rot away? What happens when some curious urban explorer breaks into that abandoned wing 20 years from now and opens that stall door? Is she still sitting there, chewing on dirty paper, waiting for someone to pull it out of her throat? I don't know. Honestly, has anyone else ever experienced something like this? Like being in a building where a room is just sealed off? And you know for an absolute fact that it's supposed to be empty, but it's not silent. If you've ever had to walk past a door that breathes, please drop a comment or something. I just need to know I'm not the only one carrying this weird, specific kind of paranoia around. Because it feels incredibly isolating. Anyway, I'm sorry for rambling on so long. It's just one of those memories that kind of claws its way up my throat when the lights go out. I really appreciate you guys sitting through this and just letting me vent. It helps, honestly. It takes a bit of the weight off. If you're using public restrooms anytime soon, just keep your headphones out. Trust your gut. If the air gets cold, just leave. Don't wait to see if the stall door opens. Just stay safe out there, okay? I actually teach at a university now, which makes looking back on this whole thing feel incredibly surreal. Almost like a twisted joke that the universe is playing on me. Don't worry, the campus where I lecture today is perfectly fine, completely normal, and I've never felt so much as a cold draft in the hallways. But the place where I got my degree, the place where I actually experienced this, that's a completely different story. I'm gonna change a few names here just to protect my own job, but let's just say my name is Cade. And back then, I was a senior at a pretty massive food industry university over in Tanfu. This happened maybe 6 or 7 years ago, back when I was in my 4th year. You know how college is. It's not like high school where you sit at the same desk in the same room all year round. You're constantly migrating, dragging your tired body from building to building depending on the subject. And there was this one specific lecture hall on the ground floor of an older building that I had only been in maybe 3 or 4 times since I was a freshman. It was just one of those generic, echoey rooms with heavy wooden desks bolted to the floor and fluorescent lights that always seemed to have a faint, annoying buzz to them. It was a completely unremarkable Tuesday, and I was hanging out with two of my buddies after our morning class finished up right around 11. We were packing up our bags, fully intending to head out, when I pulled out my phone to double-check my schedule for the week. My stomach instantly dropped when I realized that we actually had another class, in that exact same room, starting at 1 in the afternoon. I showed my phone to my friends, and we all just let out this collective groan of pure exhaustion. Back then, we were broke, and I don't mean just tightly budgeted college students. I mean we were scraping the bottom of the barrel. Rural kids trying to survive in the big city where spending even $2 or $3 on a cheap iced coffee at a cafe, just to kill time, felt like a massive financial burden. We didn't want to go to an internet cafe. We didn't want to walk around in the blistering midday heat. And honestly, even starting up our motorbikes to go anywhere felt like a waste of precious gas money. So, being the lazy, perpetually exhausted seniors that we were, I suggested that we just pull a few tables together in the back of the classroom and sleep right there until the afternoon session started. My buddies agreed instantly, completely worn out from their part-time shifts the night before. We pushed these heavy wooden desks together to make a makeshift bed, tossing our backpacks down as pillows. Before I laid down, I made sure to set an alarm on my phone for 12:30. I specifically chose that time because I wanted to give us a solid 30 minutes to wake up, wipe the drool off our faces, and push the desks back into their proper rows before the girls in our class started walking in. Because let's be real, it's kind of embarrassing to be caught sleeping like a bunch of homeless guys by the girls you're trying to impress. I passed out pretty fast. The room was stuffy, but that deep fatigue just pulled me under. When my phone alarm finally started blaring its default chime at 12:30, it felt like I had only closed my eyes for 5 seconds. I groaned, rubbing the sleep out of my eyes, and sat up, stretching my stiff back. I kicked the legs of my two friends, telling them to get up so we could arrange the furniture, but they just swatted my feet away, groaning and begging for just 5 more minutes. They were completely dead to the world. I rolled my eyes, feeling that familiar annoyance of being the only responsible one in the group, but I decided to let them sleep for a few more minutes. I grabbed my phone, walked up to the very front of the classroom, and sat down at the first row of desks just to scroll through social media and wake my brain up. Now, I need to explain the layout of this specific spot so you understand why my brain tried so hard to rationalize what happened next. Right next to the front entrance of our classroom, sharing the same wall, was this old storage room. It had these heavy, industrial double doors made of solid steel, painted a chipped, faded green. From where I was sitting at the front desk, all I had to do was glance slightly to my left through the open doorway of our classroom, and I had a clear, unobstructed view of those metal storage doors. I was just mindlessly scrolling, probably looking at some dumb meme, when the heavy midday silence of the campus was suddenly interrupted by this dull, rhythmic thudding noise. It wasn't a frantic pounding. It was a slow, deliberate sound, vibrating right through the thin walls and into the floorboards under my sneakers, almost like a heavy fist wrapped in cloth was rhythmically striking the metal door from the inside. Thud, thud, thud. I paused, lowering my phone, and tilted my head toward the hallway. At 12:30 in the afternoon, the university wasn't completely abandoned, but it was incredibly sparse. You might have a few random kids sitting on stone benches outside, or someone napping in a distant corridor, but the immediate vicinity was dead quiet. I leaned over my desk, sticking my head out just enough to look at the storage room doors. The double doors were shut, secured right in the center by this massive, heavy-duty brass padlock that linked the two metal handles together. But as I watched, the center of the doors suddenly buckled outward with a metallic groan, as if someone inside had just thrown their shoulder against the gap. The padlock strained, stretching the metal loops it was hooked through to their absolute limit, before the door snapped back flush with the frame. Then it happened again. The doors bulged out, the padlock clanked tightly against the steel, and then they snapped back. My immediate thought, the absolute first place my tired brain went to, was that some stupid freshmen were playing a prank, or someone had accidentally gotten locked inside while looking for supplies. I mean, it was a university, not a haunted house, so obviously there was a logical explanation. I was just about to stand up and go see if they needed me to call campus security. When the bulging stopped, I kept my eyes locked on the gap between the doors. The padlock was still hanging there, securing the handles, but then, incredibly slowly, the right side of the metal door began to creak open. It only opened about a hand span, maybe 6 or 7 inches, just enough to slip a face through. And that's exactly what happened. From the pitch-black darkness of that storage room, a girl's head poked out into the bright hallway light. She looked like a typical student, maybe 19 or 20, with this very distinct, heavy, blunt-cut fringe, which was a super popular hairstyle around here several years ago. Her skin was incredibly pale, almost chalky, but the thing that stood out the most were her eyes. They were completely round, wide, and staring straight ahead like glass marbles. She didn't look at me. She didn't scream for help. She just slowly swiveled her neck, looking up the hallway, then down the hallway, with this blank, terrifyingly empty expression on her face. Then, without making a single sound, she pulled her head back into the darkness, and the heavy metal door gently clicked shut. I just sat there, blinking. My heart had done a weird little flutter, but I forcefully pushed the unease down into the pit of my stomach. My brain immediately started weaving this complex net of excuses. I told myself that it was probably just a group of female students who had snuck into an empty room to sleep privately, and she was just poking her head out to check the time or see if the hallways were getting busy. I mean, we were sleeping in a classroom. Why couldn't they sleep in the storage room? Sure, it was weird, but college kids do weird stuff. I convinced myself I was just being a creep for staring, so I pulled my eyes away, hunched back over my desk, and forced myself to focus on my phone screen. But my hands were slightly clammy, and the air in the room suddenly felt suffocatingly still. Maybe a minute passed, not even 2 full minutes, and then the door exploded. A deafening, violent crash echoed through the hallway, making my entire body jolt violently in my chair. It sounded like someone was taking a sledgehammer to the inside of the steel doors. The relentless, concussive booming was so intense that the acoustic tiles in the ceiling above me actually vibrated. I whipped my head around, my breathing suddenly shallow, and stared at the storage room. The heavy doors were bowing outward violently under the immense pressure of whatever was hitting them, and the massive brass padlock on the outside was bouncing and clanking frantically against the metal surface. And right then, right at that exact fraction of a second, my logical brain completely shattered. I saw the padlock. It was on the outside. It was fully locked, fully engaged, securing the 2 handles together. If the padlock was locked on the outside, how in the absolute hell did that girl open the door 6 inches just 2 minutes ago? How did she stick her head out if the heavy brass lock was physically binding the 2 panels together? And more importantly, if someone was trapped inside and panicking enough to hit the door that hard, why weren't they screaming? There was no voice, no cries for help, just the cold, mechanical, flesh-tearing thud against the steel. A wave of pure, primal nausea hit me. I felt like I was going to throw up. My legs moved before my brain gave the order, driven by some stupid, ingrained instinct to investigate, to be the hero, to figure out what the hell was going on. I stepped out of the classroom, my sneakers squeaking against the polished floor, and took a few hesitant steps toward the storage room. I was maybe 6 feet away. The violent banging stopped instantly. The silence that followed was so absolute it made my ears ring. I stared at the center of the doors. The heavy brass padlock was gone. It wasn't broken. It wasn't hanging open. It was completely, physically erased from reality. Before I could even process that impossibility, the right side of the metal door began to creak open again, exactly like before, 1 slow, agonizing inch at a time, until there was about a hand span of empty space. My lungs completely seized up. I couldn't pull air in. I just stood there, paralyzed, watching the darkness in the crack. and then she pushed her head out again. It was the same girl, the same blunt, dark bangs, but this time, oh God, her face. The entire left side of her face was caved inward, completely crushed into a pulpy, dark red crater that looked like it had been forcefully compressed in a vise, the bone structure beneath entirely obliterated so that her cheekbone was just gone, replaced by a sunken, glistening hollow of ruined flesh. But the most horrifying part, the part that makes me wake up in a cold sweat even years later, were her eyes. Because her face was crushed, the skin around her left eye had been pulled back or torn away, completely removing her eyelids. The eyeball itself was fully exposed, bulging out of its socket, utterly unprotected, and locked in a wide, unblinking state of absolute trauma. The wet, coppery smell of old blood hit the back of my throat, making me gag, but I couldn't look away. I was trapped in this state of sheer terror, and my brain, desperately trying to protect my sanity, forcefully dragged my focus away from the gore and locked my eyes onto a tiny, shiny silver hairpin holding back a piece of her bloody hair. It was perfectly clean. The silver clip was completely pristine. I just stared at that little piece of metal while the mangled, mutilated ruin of a human being swiveled her neck, looking up and down the hallway with that same blank, empty curiosity. She never looked at me. I was standing less than 6 feet away, completely exposed, but it was like I didn't even exist in her dimension. Then, she slowly dragged her head back into the pitch black, and the heavy steel door clicked shut. "What the fuck?" The whisper tore out of my dry throat completely involuntarily, my voice cracking under the sheer pressure of the adrenaline flooding my system. "Hey, Cade, what are you doing standing out there staring at the wall?" The sudden, groggy voice from inside the classroom made me jump so hard I nearly bit through my own tongue. I spun around, gasping for air, to see my two buddies finally sitting up from the desks, rubbing their eyes and stretching. I whipped my head back toward the storage room. The heavy brass padlock was hanging right there, dead center, locked tight, completely undisturbed. I stumbled back into the classroom, my hands shaking so violently I had to press them against my thighs. I started stammering, the words tumbling out of my mouth in this frantic, disjointed mess, trying to explain the banging, the missing lock, the girl with the crushed face. My friends just stared at me like I had lost my goddamn mind. They laughed, telling me I was clearly sleep-deprived from my part-time job, that I probably had a waking nightmare, or was just hallucinating from the heat. They completely dismissed me, telling me to grab a desk and start arranging the room before the professor showed up. I felt this isolating, suffocating wave of helplessness wash over me. I wasn't crazy. I know what I saw. Just then, I heard the heavy, rhythmic clacking of leather boots echoing down the hallway. It was the older campus security guard, walking his midday route to flip the breaker switches and cut the power to empty rooms to save electricity. I practically sprinted out of the classroom, cutting him off in the hallway, wildly pointing at the storage room doors. I frantically tried to explain that something was wrong, that someone or something was locked in there, and the door was acting crazy. The guard didn't even look surprised. He just looked incredibly tired. He let out this deep, heavy sigh that seemed to carry years of exhaustion. He walked over to the storage room, grabbed the heavy brass padlock, gave it a few firm tugs to ensure it was secure, and then turned back to me with a stern, warning glare. He ordered us to go back inside our classroom, telling us to stop spreading stupid rumors unless we wanted to get suspended by the administration. He treated it like an annoyance, like a leaking pipe he had to deal with every week. We were officially put in our place, so we dragged the desks back into rows just as the other students started trickling in for the 1 o'clock session. I sat down, my mind completely numb, unable to process the absolute violation of reality I had just witnessed. About 15 minutes into the lecture, while the professor was writing on the board, I glanced out the open door and saw the security guard walk by again, but this time, he was holding a thick plastic package. He ripped the cardboard backing off, pulled out a brand new, shiny brass padlock, walked over to the storage room, and swapped out the old one. Why would he replace a perfectly good lock? I must have been staring with my jaw unhinged, because the guy sitting next to me, a senior who had taken a lot more classes in this specific building than I had, nudged me hard in the ribs. He leaned in close, keeping his voice to a barely audible whisper, and warned me that staring at that room was a good way to get something attached to me. I turned to him, my skin crawling, and asked him if the rumors about the ghost were actually true. He gave a grim little nod and told me to check the old university forums, the ones the admins were always trying to scrub. Apparently, several years prior, a junior girl had gotten entangled in a deeply messy, secretive affair with one of the married professors. When the wife found out, and the whole thing blew up, threatening her entire future and reputation, the girl couldn't handle it. During the quiet lunch break, when the campus was dead, she hid inside that room, which actually used to be a regular classroom before they converted it, and ended her own life. The guy looked at me, dead in the eyes, and said, "She's trapped in there, man. They say if you stay in the halls during lunch, you can hear her trying to break out. The banging gets so violent that she actually shatters the internal mechanisms of those heavy padlocks. That's why the guards have to replace them every month. She physically breaks them from the inside." Looking back on it now, sitting in my own office as an adult, that's the part that truly haunts me. It's the physical evidence that breaks my brain. It's one thing to see a ghost. It's one thing to have a hallucination fueled by heat and exhaustion. But what happens when the hallucination leaves physical damage? I keep picturing that brand new padlock being ripped out of its plastic packaging. The school administration knows. The guards know. They literally have a budget allocated to replacing the locks that a dead girl destroys in her endless looping panic. And it makes me wonder, when she opened that door and peeked out with that mutilated face, was she looking for her professor? Or was she just blindly searching for a way out of a loop she can never escape? Has anyone listening to this ever gone to a university with a secret like that? A place where the staff just quietly cleans up the mess of a haunting without ever acknowledging it? Have you ever found a physical object that proved your absolute worst nightmare was actually real? Because I swear, that realization is 1,000 times worse than the jump scare itself. If you are currently a college student, especially if you're taking summer classes or staying on campus during those quiet, empty hours, please, trust your gut. If you hear a noise that shouldn't be there, don't try to be the hero. And don't try to find a logical explanation. Just pack your bags and leave. I hope you never have to find out what happens when the lock on the door finally gives way entirely. I don't really know how to start this, to be honest, but I need to get it out of my head, because every time I see an old tree, my chest gets tight. This happened a long time ago, back when I was in the 3rd grade, but my brain still holds onto it like it was yesterday. I was a really, really skinny kid, like clinically malnourished, visible ribs, always getting sick kind of skinny. I grew up in Vietnam, specifically near Cho Lan, which is this incredibly dense, historical Chinatown district, where the air always smells like a heavy mix of exhaust fumes and bitter herbal medicine. Because I was so small and so slow, I was the ultimate target. There were these 2 massive kids in my class. Let's just call them Keegan and Preston. I don't know what they were feeding these kids, but they were built like tanks compared to me, and they made my life an absolute living hell. It started with the standard crap, you know? Shoving me in the hallways, knocking my books out of my hands, stealing my pencils, the kind of low-level torment that teachers never seemed to notice. But it peaked one afternoon. I was taking my sweet time packing my bag, because I was just slow at everything back then, and the second the teacher stepped out of the room, they jumped me. It wasn't just Keegan and Preston either. They brought like 5 other kids. They just swarmed me. I remember the smell of dusty chalk and cheap floor wax as I hit the ground, and they just started kicking and punching. My nose was bleeding, my eyes were swelling up, and I remember looking up at Keegan and asking him through my tears why he was doing this, and he just sneered and told me he hit me because he felt like it, and because I packed my bag too slow. Kids are psychopaths, man. They really are. The worst part is, I didn't even want to tell my parents. Keegan threatened that if I snitched, he'd kill me, and my dumb 8-year-old brain believed him. So I walked out to the school gate with my uniform covered in dirt and blood, trying to hide my face, but my dad was there to pick me up. He took one look at me and completely lost his mind. He dragged the truth out of me, and the very next day he marched into the principal's office and raised absolute hell. It was this huge ordeal. The bullies got their conduct grades slashed. Their parents were brought in. The whole 9 yards. But my dad knew that just getting them in trouble wasn't going to magically make me safe. As we were walking out of the school that afternoon, holding hands, he stopped by the security booth. There was this big glass corkboard where they pinned up extracurricular flyers, and right in the center was an ad for an after-school taekwondo class held right there in the school courtyard. My dad didn't even hesitate. He signed me up on the spot, telling me that I was going to bulk up, learn how to fight, and become the next Bruce Lee, and that once those kids saw me wearing a martial arts uniform, they'd never lay a finger on me again. I was actually kind of pumped about it. We went and bought the crisp white uniform, the belt, the whole setup, and surprisingly, my dad was right. Once word got out that I was taking martial arts, Keegan and his crew completely backed off. I guess the combination of the principal breathing down their necks and the idea of me learning how to kick people in the face was enough to keep them away. But that class, man, that class was the start of something so much worse than getting bullied. You have to understand the layout of my elementary school to get why this was so creepy. It was located near Tran Hung Dao Street, which is this massive, ancient avenue lined with these towering trees that were planted by the French colonialists over a century ago. These trees are gargantuan. Their roots tear up the sidewalks, and their canopies are so thick that they practically form a roof over the street. My school was a 3-story building right next to these trees, and by the time my evening class started, usually around 6:30 or 7 p.m., the school was entirely deserted. The courtyard was pitch black except for maybe 4 or 5 tall floodlights pointing down at the flagpole where our small class of maybe 10 or 12 kids would line up to practice. Everything outside of that circle of light was just an abyss. The branches of those massive French trees draped over the walls, casting these long, jagged shadows that looked like skeletal fingers reaching toward the courtyard. My dad didn't stick around to watch. He'd just drop me off, hand me over to the instructor, and leave. I remember my very first night. We were doing basic punching drills, standing in rows, when I got completely distracted by this sound. It was the birds. Now in the city you hear birds all the time during the day, but at night, it's supposed to be quiet. But up in those massive trees, there was this frantic, high-pitched screeching. It wasn't a normal bird song. It sounded panicked. It sounded like they were in pain. Just this chaotic, overlapping chorus of shrieks. I stopped punching and looked up past the floodlights toward the 3rd floor of the school. The roof of the building was a few feet lower than the top of the tree canopy, and as I was squinting into the dark, I saw them. Dozens of birds. They were swooping down from the branches in these erratic, aggressive dive bombs, heading straight for the top floor of the school. But they weren't landing. I watched, completely paralyzed, as 3 of them flew full speed, head first into the concrete wall near the roof. It wasn't a graze. I heard the sickening wet thud over the sound of the wind. Just smack. And then they dropped like stones, hitting the concrete courtyard a few yards away from us with this heavy, fleshy slap. The other birds didn't stop. A few of them swooped down and started frantically pecking at the bodies of the dead ones on the ground, almost like they were checking if they were alive. And when they realized they weren't, they just flew back up into the dark and started screaming again. I was terrified, but my brain instantly started doing that thing where you try to force logic onto something impossible. I told myself it was just light pollution. Yeah, that had to be it. I remembered reading somewhere that city lights mess with birds' navigation systems, so they were probably just blinded by the floodlights and couldn't see the wall. It was sad, but it was just nature being stupid. I tried to push it out of my mind. When the class ended and we were waiting for our parents, I started walking toward the edge of the light to look at the dead birds, but our instructor completely snapped at me. He told me to stay in the light and not go wandering around in the dark. Then I watched him walk over to the old security guard, who was sitting in his little booth, and whisper something. The guard just sighed, grabbed a push broom and a dustpan, and walked over to the shadows with a flashlight. He swept up the little bodies like they were just pieces of trash, dumping them into a black bin before my dad arrived. I told my dad about it on the ride home, and he basically fed me the exact same rationalization I had come up with. He said birds have terrible night vision, and they just crashed. Nothing to worry about. But it wasn't a one-time thing. I had class 3 nights a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And for 2 straight weeks, it happened every single freaking time. It became this routine of absolute dread. I would be standing there in my white uniform, punching the air, and my stomach would just tie into knots the second I heard that frantic chirping start up in the canopy. And then, without fail, I'd hear it. The screaming, the dive bombing, and then that wet, heavy smack against the 3rd floor wall. Sometimes it was 1 bird, sometimes it was 5. But every single night, those birds threw themselves at that specific spot on the building until they died, and every single night, the guard would shuffle out with his broom and sweep them away. It was absolute bullshit. Animals don't just commit mass suicide like that, night after night, in the exact same spot. I was getting so anxious that I couldn't even focus on the martial arts. I just kept staring up at the dark windows of the 3rd floor, wondering what the hell was pulling them in. Things finally hit a breaking point in my 3rd week. Our instructor had some sort of emergency. Maybe a family thing, or maybe he just wanted to go drink. I don't know, but he ended class about 10 minutes early. He told us to sit on the benches near the security booth while we waited for our parents, and then he hopped on his motorbike and took off. The security guard was supposed to be watching us, but he was this old, checked-out guy who just pulled his glasses down his nose and buried his face in a newspaper, totally ignoring us. Of course, the oldest kid in our class, this 5th grader, who always acted like he owned the place, saw an opportunity. The birds had just done their nightly kamikaze dive a few minutes prior, and the guard hadn't swept them up yet. The 5th grader smirked and dared us to go look at the bodies with him, joking that we should take them home and grill them. I didn't want to go. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to stay under the light, but peer pressure is a hell of a drug when you're 8 years old, so I followed him and a couple of other kids to the edge of the courtyard, right where the shadows swallowed the concrete. We had to squint to see, but kids have unnaturally good night vision. When my eyes adjusted, my stomach violently lurched into my throat. There were 4 birds on the ground, but they weren't just dead from hitting a wall. They were destroyed. There were feathers and blood splattered in a 2-foot radius. One of them had its neck bent at an angle that shouldn't be physically possible, and another one was completely burst open, its insides spilling out onto the pavement. It looked like something had caught them mid-air and physically crushed them in a giant fist before throwing them at the ground. The smell of raw, metallic blood and rotting leaves was so strong, I actually gagged. While I was staring at the gore, trying not to throw up, the 5th grader suddenly gasped and scrambled backward, pointing up at the building. His face was completely drained of color, just ghost white. He started stammering, pointing a shaking finger at the 3rd floor, swearing to God that he saw a man standing up there by the windows, looking down at us. The other kids immediately started making fun of him, saying he was just trying to scare us, pointing out that the school was completely locked up and all the teachers were gone. I didn't see anyone up there, but the sheer unadulterated terror in that older kid's eyes was so contagious that I almost wet myself. We all sprinted back to the light just as the security guard finally yelled at us to sit down and shut up. When my dad picked me up that night, I didn't say a word. I couldn't. I was trembling so hard my teeth were clicking together. That night, the nightmare started. I can still see it so vividly it makes my skin crawl. In the dream, I was trapped in the school courtyard, but there were no floodlights. It was pitch black, and I was running because there was this massive, towering shadow, easily 10 feet tall, chasing me around the perimeter. But the absolute worst part, the part that makes me want to rip my own ears off just thinking about it, was the sound of the birds. In the waking world, their chirping was annoying, but in the dream, it was deafening. It was this chaotic, ear-piercing cacophony of shrieks vibrating inside my actual skull, and I could feel the birds dive-bombing my head, their cold claws tangling in my hair, their beaks tearing at my scalp, while that massive shadow just glided closer and closer. I woke up screaming, thrashing around in my tangled bedsheets, completely drenched in a cold, sour sweat. I begged my parents the next morning. I literally dropped to my knees and begged them not to make me go back to that class. I told them I was terrified, that I'd rather let Keegan beat me to a pulp every single day than go back to that dark courtyard. But my dad just brushed it off. He told me I was being dramatic, that I probably just watched a scary movie, and that I wasn't going to quit just because I had a bad dream. So I had to go back. For a whole month, I lived in a state of constant, suffocating dread. I would go to the class, clench my jaw, try to ignore the sickening thuds of the birds dying in the dark, and then I would go home and have the exact same nightmare. Every single Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, the shadow chasing me, the birds tearing at my flesh, the suffocating darkness. It completely broke me physically. I stopped eating. I lost what little weight I had left. I started getting these aggressive, burning fevers that would leave me shivering on the bathroom floor. Finally, my mom couldn't take it anymore. She saw me wasting away, and her maternal intuition kicked in. She told my dad that something was deeply wrong, that kids don't just consistently lie about the exact same nightmare for a month straight while their health deteriorates. She decided to pull me out of the class. The relief I felt when she told me I didn't have to go back was indescribable. It was like I could finally breathe again. A few days later, after my fever broke, my mom walked me to school for my regular daytime classes. But she didn't leave. She marched straight into the principal's office to officially withdraw me from the after-school program and, I guess, to demand some answers about what the hell was going on in that courtyard. I didn't know what they talked about until lunchtime. When the bell rang for the midday break, I walked out of my classroom and found my mom and the female principal waiting for me in the hallway. The principal had this incredibly sad, pitying look on her face. She patted my head, and then, without explaining anything, she and my mom led me toward the main stairwell. Instead of going down to the exit, we went up. We walked all the way up to the 3rd floor. I had never been up there before. It was the oldest part of the building, and it was dead silent compared to the chaos of the kids playing downstairs. They walked me to the very end of the corridor, right to the corner room that faced those massive French trees. The wooden sign above the door said, Class 5-3. But it wasn't a classroom. The door was wide open, and the room was completely hollowed out. There were no desks, no chairs, no chalkboard. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the corners were choked with heavy cobwebs. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades. But at the very back of the room, positioned perfectly to look out the window toward the courtyard, was a wooden altar. It was an old, intricately carved shrine. There were no photographs on it, just a wooden tablet with faded Chinese characters etched into it. Sitting in front of the tablet was a heavy brass incense burner, and there were 3 sticks of incense actively burning in it. The thick, fragrant smoke was curling up into the stale air. The principal walked over to the windowsill, picked up a cheap plastic lighter and a fresh pack of incense. She lit 3 sticks, handed them to me, and gently told me to pay my respects. I didn't understand what I was doing, but the heavy, oppressive energy in that room made me compliant. I held the incense, bowed my head, and placed them in the ash. From where I stood at the altar, I could look straight out the window. The dense, sprawling branches of the ancient trees were maybe 15 feet away. I could hear the birds fluttering around out there in the harsh daylight. It felt so uncomfortably close. We left after that. My mom enrolled me in a different martial arts center miles away, and I never set foot in that school courtyard after dark ever again. It wasn't until a few years later that I finally overheard my parents talking about it in the kitchen, and the puzzle pieces finally clicked together in a way that makes me sick to my stomach to this day. That wooden tablet? It belonged to a man named Mr. Quach. Long before the government took over the land to build a public school, that entire plot of real estate belonged to him. He was a wealthy Chinese landowner from the old days, and he had died on that very property. The school had tried to use that corner room on the 3rd floor as a regular classroom for years, but things kept happening. I don't know the details, but it was bad enough that multiple generations of principals, government-appointed officials who weren't supposed to believe in this kind of stuff, eventually gave up. They cleared out the room, set up the altar, and surrendered that space back to Mr. Quach. He was the landlord, and he never left. For the most part, he left the students alone during the day. We were just passing through, but the night belonged to him, and for whatever twisted, incomprehensible reason, he hated the birds. Or maybe he just liked torturing them. Maybe he was the one pulling them from the trees, messing with their heads, forcing them to crash into his wall over and over again just for his own sick entertainment. I realized later why I always saw maintenance workers painting over that specific section of the exterior wall every couple of months. The pale yellow paint was always fresh in that one spot near the roof, covering up the dark, rusty stains of dried blood that accumulated night after night. I still think about it all the time. I think about how close I was to whatever was standing in that window. I think about the fact that if I hadn't gotten sick, I would have kept standing in that dark courtyard, letting whatever invisible frequency that was driving those birds insane wash over me too. It makes me wonder, have any of you ever lived near a really old property and noticed the local wildlife acting completely unnatural? Like dogs barking at empty corners, or birds just dropping dead out of the sky for no reason? If you have, I really need you to tell me about it in the comments, because I need to know I'm not the only one who realizes that sometimes the things that haunt us aren't even interested in us. We're just trespassing in their space. If you're walking home tonight, especially near any old trees, just keep your head down. Don't look up into the branches. You really don't want to know what's looking back down at you. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing by talking about this, but it's been over 10 years, and I still can't really sleep in a totally dark room without feeling this heavy pressure in the air. I'm the youngest in my family. I had, 2 older brothers. They were twins, Hayes and Thatcher. Our parents raised us strict, hoping we'd grow up to be these peaceful, obedient sons, which is kind of a joke looking back. We grew up in Tianjiang, a sweltering province down south where the river air is so thick it feels like you're breathing warm soup, and you just sweat through your clothes the second you step outside. Even though Hayes and Thatcher were twins, they couldn't have been more different. Thatcher was a brawler. Even when we were like 4 or 5, people around the neighborhood called him a little thug, not in a totally mean way, just he was the kid who would take your toys and punch you if you tried to get them back. But Hayes was quiet. He was incredibly gentle, soft-spoken, and, well, he was gay. He didn't come out or anything, not back then, but by the time he hit middle school, it was obvious. He was skinny, fair-skinned, liked keeping his hair a little longer, and he only ever hung out with the girls. Through elementary school, it was fine because Thatcher was basically the king of the playground. Nobody messed with Hayes because Thatcher would absolutely destroy them. He was fiercely protective of his twin. But when they hit 6th grade, the school separated them into different classes. The teachers knew if they put them together, they'd just talk and goof off, so they split them up. And that's when the nightmare started for Hayes. Without Thatcher there, Hayes became the prime target. It was relentless. He would come home with a bruised eye, ripped shirts, his notebooks completely scribbled over and torn up. And the teachers didn't do crap about it. Some of them even blamed him, saying his attitude, or his softness, provoked the other boys. It was incredibly screwed up. Things peaked in 9th grade. Hayes was about 15. A group of guys beat him so badly he actually passed out and ended up in the school nurse's office. When Thatcher found out, he went completely feral. He tracked down the main guy who did it and cracked his head open so bad, the kid had to go to the hospital. My parents were furious. The school was threatening expulsion, and my folks were actively looking to pull both of them out and transfer them to a different district. But before the paperwork even went through, Hayes died. I was only in 7th grade. I remember my aunt pulling me out of class in the middle of the day. She didn't take me home. She took me straight to the provincial hospital. When I walked into the hallway, I saw my parents and Thatcher just collapsed on the floor next to a gurney, sobbing hysterically. There was a white sheet pulled over the body, and it was soaked in red. The doctors pulled the sheet back for a second so they could transfer him to the morgue, and I saw his face. I saw my brother's face. His head was basically resting sideways on the stretcher, and the angle was all wrong. It looked like a chicken when someone tries to cut its neck but a flap of skin is still holding the head on. His eyes were half open. I completely froze. I couldn't breathe. I was just a kid, and looking at that, it broke something inside my brain. We found out later that Hayes had been severely depressed. He was being bullied. The teachers hated him. And on top of that, we found out he had a secret boyfriend who had just dumped him because of the peer pressure. So that morning, Hayes skipped school. He was just wandering aimlessly along Highway 1A, this massive, unforgiving stretch of highway where truckers and buses blow past at 80 miles an hour. He was walking near the median, and a guy on a motorbike, who was completely blackout drunk in the middle of the day, hit him. But he didn't just hit him. The bike's handlebars or something caught Hayes by the collar, and the guy panicked and didn't stop. He dragged my brother for almost 300 feet down the asphalt. The edge of the metal exhaust pipe just kept digging and sawing into Hayes' neck the whole way. We buried him. The funeral was a blur of crying and chanting, and this suffocating smell of incense that just coated the back of my throat. But the thing is, Hayes didn't really leave. Not right away. In our culture, there's this belief that for 49 days after someone dies, their soul is still tethered here. They wander around, settling debts, before they finally cross over. I thought it was just a fairy tale to scare kids, until I started finding the books. See, Hayes used to read this hardcore gay adult smut, like explicit stuff that a guy, especially living with a hyper-masculine twin like Thatcher, definitely couldn't be caught dead reading. To hide them from our parents, he used to stash them in my room, hidden behind my little pink desk lamp. I didn't care. I just let him keep them there. A few days after the funeral, I came home from school, went into my room to put my backpack away, and saw one of his manga books lying open on my desk. It was flipped to the middle, exactly like someone had just put it down to go to the bathroom. I stared at it, and my brain instantly did that thing where it tries to protect you from going crazy. I just told myself, oh, I must have pulled it out last night while I was grieving and forgot to put it away. I picked it up, feeling my eyes get watery, and shoved it back on the shelf. But then, the next afternoon after I took a shower, I walked back into my room, and a totally different volume was sitting open on my desk. I was getting a little annoyed. I marched over to Thatcher's room and yelled at him for going into my stuff and messing with my books. Thatcher looked at me like I was insane and told me to get lost, saying he didn't give a damn about my stupid girly comics and that only me and Hayes ever touched that garbage. That sent a weird little prickle down my spine, but I just brushed it off. That night, I was lying in bed in the dark. My desk is maybe 10 feet away from my bed. The house was dead quiet. I was just drifting off when I heard it. It wasn't a sudden noise, it was this slow, agonizingly deliberate scraping sound, like the dry pad of a finger dragging across rough paper, followed by the faint thwack of a page turning, and then a few seconds of silence before it happened again. I opened my eyes, and my breath hitched in my throat because my pink desk lamp, the one I had literally unplugged and shoved into the corner months ago, was sitting dead center on the desk, fully plugged in and glowing bright yellow, spotlighting an open manga. I just lay there, paralyzed, watching the book. About 10 seconds passed, and then the page just flipped. It didn't blow in the wind. It lifted up, arced over, and pressed itself flat on the other side. I couldn't handle it. I sat up really fast, trying to figure out what the hell I was looking at, and the second I moved, the book just went crazy. The pages started flipping aggressively. Swish, 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 tearing through the rest of the chapters in a blur until the back cover flipped over and the book slammed shut. The instant it closed, the desk lamp snapped off. pitch black. I sat in the dark, violently rubbing my eyes, thinking I was having a night terror. When my eyes adjusted to the moonlight coming through the window, I could see the book was lying closed on the desk. The lamp was right next to it. It wasn't a dream. I scrambled out of bed, sprinting across the hall to Thatcher's room, practically crying, begging him to let me sleep on his floor because I was terrified. The next morning, I took every single one of Hayes's books, shoved them in a plastic bag along with the lamp, and dropped them in his empty bedroom. The page turning stopped after that. I figured he just wanted his stuff back, but I was so naive. That was just him saying hi to me. What he did to the people who hurt him, that was a whole different level of fucked up. About a week later, this older couple showed up at our house. They looked miserable, just haggard and exhausted. They told my parents they were Thorne's parents. Thorne was the guy who had tormented Hayes for 4 years, the one Thatcher had hospitalized. They stood in our living room, wringing their hands, and begged my parents to let them light incense at Hayes's altar. They said Thorne had basically lost his mind. He hadn't gone to school in 10 days. He refused to leave his room, and every night, he would wake up screaming bloody murder. The mom, shaking, confessed what Thorne had seen on the very first night of Hayes's funeral. Thorne had been sitting by his bedroom window, looking out at the dark street, when he saw a shadowy figure walking toward his house. Thorne was a tough guy, so he opened the window and yelled at the guy to get lost before he came out and beat his ass. But the figure didn't stop. It just kept walking into the glow of the street lamp. And Thorne realized it was Hayes, but Hayes's head wasn't right. As he walked, his head was severely tilted, drooping further and further down with every step until it snapped completely sideways, resting totally flat against his own shoulder. It was the exact horrific injury from the accident, and he was just shuffling toward Thorne's window, staring up at him with dead, half-open eyes. Thorne's parents said they heard a crash and ran into his room to find their tough bully of a son kneeling on his desk, violently slamming his own forehead against the window frame, weeping and begging Hayes to leave him alone. He kept screaming that the boy with the broken neck was inside the walls, crawling on the ceiling, waiting for him in the bathroom. They begged my parents to forgive Thorne, to tell Hayes's spirit to let him go. They lit their incense at the altar. My parents, who are way better people than I am, kindly told the spirit to drop the grudge, but I was the one who cleared the table after they left, and I saw it. The 4 sticks of incense they lit, 2 of them had burned perfectly straight, but the 2 sticks planted by Thorne's parents, they had curled completely backwards, bending into an unnatural U shape like a twisted, deformed finger, pointing right back at the front door. And as soon as they backed their motorbike out of our driveway, the heavy fruit basket they brought as an offering physically launched itself off the altar, smashing into the floor and taking a vase of water down with it. He didn't forgive them. Not right away. Thorne ended up transferring to a school in a completely different city a week later just to escape the haunting. And it wasn't just him. A few days later, Hayes's homeroom teacher, the one who always moved him to the back of the class and ignored his bullies, came over. She looked terrified. She told my parents that ever since the funeral, no one could sit at Hayes's old desk. Kids were getting poked in the ribs when no one was behind them. Their pencils and books would vanish from inside their backpacks and end up neatly stacked inside the desk's cubby. Some kids would fall asleep in class and wake up screaming because a boy's voice whispered their name directly into their ear. They tried to move the desk to the basement storage, but the janitor mysteriously lost the only key to the storage room the exact day they tried to move it. The teacher lit incense, cried, and apologized. A few days later, the school principal came over and did the same. Only then did the classroom go back to normal. But the most gut-wrenching one was Xavier. Xavier was the secret boyfriend. Nobody in my family even knew he existed until his mother dragged him to our house. Xavier was this big, athletic, masculine guy. You would never guess he was with my brother. But when he sat down in our living room, he kept his arms crossed, and I could see his forearms were covered in these fresh, angry cigarette burns and razor cuts. His mother, looking incredibly ashamed, explained that Xavier hadn't slept in days. He told her that he was waking up paralyzed in his bed. He couldn't move his arms or his legs, and he could feel the mattress dip right beside him. And then, he would feel a hand slip into his. It wasn't a warm hand. Xavier told his mom it felt like a block of heavy, rigid ice shaped like human fingers, locking perfectly between his own fingers. It would grip him so tight his knuckles ached, and a voice would just quietly whimper and cry next to his ear, calling him husband in the dark. Xavier just sat there in our living room, staring at the floor, absolutely petrified. He realized that by breaking up with Hayes to save his own reputation, he had pushed him over the edge. He lit incense, crying silently, and stood in front of the altar muttering apologies for almost 10 minutes. It felt like Hayes was just going down a checklist, hunting down every single person who had wronged him. I started to get really scared of my own brother. I didn't know what he had become. And then, the 49th day arrived. The next morning, the 50th day, I was supposed to go on a huge middle school field trip to Soi Tien. It's this massive, kind of surreal amusement park closer to the city. The tickets cost like 200,000 dong, which was roughly $8 or $10 back then, an absolute fortune for a kid, and my parents had paid for it months before the accident. Even though we were mourning, they told me I should go, to get my mind off things. The night of the 49th day, I went to sleep incredibly excited. I had a dream. I was lying in my bed, and I looked over at my desk, and Hayes was sitting there, reading his manga. He looked totally normal. Not mangled, not dead, just my gentle older brother. In the dream, I sat up and excitedly told him I was going to Soi Tien tomorrow. He stopped reading. He slowly turned his head to look at me, and his face twisted into this mask of absolute, terrifying rage. It was an expression I had never ever seen on him. He pointed a finger at me, and his voice was guttural and overlapping, like 3 people yelling at once. "You're not going anywhere. I'll burn you up before I let you get on that bus. You stay home. You stay home." He started screaming at me that there was going to be an accident, that he would make me sick, that he wouldn't let me leave the house. I started sobbing in the dream, terrified of him, and I woke up crying for real. The second I opened my eyes, my entire body was shivering uncontrollably. My joints ached and my skin felt like it was radiating heat. It was 4 a.m. I was supposed to be at the school by 4:30. My mom came in to wake me up, took one look at me, and touched my forehead. I was burning up with a 104-degree fever. There was absolutely no way I was going on that trip. I cried bitterly, not even remembering the dream at that point, just devastated that I was missing the water park. I stayed in bed all day, sweating it out. Around 5 p.m., a neighbor down the street came sprinting to our front gate, screaming my mother's name, crying hysterically. My parents ran out. The neighbor was hyperventilating, asking if I had gone on the trip. The bus carrying my classmates, it had crashed on Highway 1A on the way back. A truck had swerved, and the bus driver had to jerk the wheel, slamming the vehicle straight into the concrete median. Over 40 kids were on board. Nobody died, thank God, but the side of the bus was shredded. 5 kids, sitting near the windows, had their arms and legs completely crushed and broken. If I had gone, I would have been sitting right next to my best friend, in the exact window seat that took the hardest hit. When my parents rushed back inside to tell me I was safe, the memory of the dream hit me like a physical punch to the chest. "I'll burn you up before I let you get on that bus." He wasn't just angry. He wasn't just a vengeful spirit terrorizing the town. He was using the last few hours he had on this earth to make sure I didn't end up on that highway with him. After that 49th day, everything stopped. The house felt normal again. The books never moved. The desk lamp stayed unplugged. Thorne and Xavier and the teachers never had another nightmare. Hayes was just gone. I still think about it all the time. Honestly, if any of you listening have ever felt that weird, heavy intuition, or if you've been forced to miss a flight or a trip because of some freak illness that just vanished the next day, please tell me I'm not the only one. Tell me I'm not crazy for believing that someone standing on the other side of the veil reached through and held me back. It brings me a lot of comfort to think he protected me, but it also leaves me with this suffocating guilt knowing that in his final moments, the world was so cruel to him, and yet his last act was to save me. I guess I just owe him my life now. Thanks for sticking around to listen to my rambling. It feels a little lighter, just getting it out of my head and into the world. If you're out driving late tonight, especially on those dark stretches of highway, just keep your eyes on the road and stay safe.